In the impenetrable darkness of the mysterious forest, under the cover of night, several black shadows glided forward, unnoticed by the human eye. Their steps were confident, almost weightless, barely touching the branches of the centuries-old trees. It was difficult, almost impossible, to understand what kind of uninvited guests or visitors were filling the space around. Suddenly, a small clearing, hidden in the thickest part of the forest, was illuminated by the soft light of a fire, and nearby lay a bundle with a small newborn creature, so the guests froze in agonizing anticipation of something unpredictable. In an instant, their faces were distorted by bloodthirsty grins, and their hands pulled out a sharp knife, clearly not to help the newborn. There was no trace left of the agonizing wait. The shadow's intentions were obvious. They began to move again, and a second later, one of the visitors threw his sword at the small, defenseless creature. It's hard to say how evil and inhumane a man must be to do something like that. But the knife hit the target. But surprisingly, there was no baby crying, although it should have been exactly the opposite, but there was no baby in the bundle. The young man didn't expect such a setup of the century, and he froze on the tree branch with a silent question in his eyes. Suddenly, the forest guest heard a voice behind him, clearly a human one, although who knows what could be found here, so he sharply turned his head towards the speaker. He didn't see anything interesting or strange. A couple of meters away from him, on a tree branch, stood an ordinary guy in a raincoat. But his gaze was not that of a cheerful teenager, but prickly, cold, as if he had killed at least 1,000 people. Not only was his look strange, but also his speech, because the men were trying to kill the child, not him, and the guy claimed that they had attacked him. And now he could do the same without a twinge of conscience. The strangeness didn't end there, and the stranger broke off a tree branch for some reason. Did he really want to defeat his enemies with it? That's hilarious. His actions caused a wave of laughter and ridicule because he was going to shoot them with a branch, an ordinary branch from a tree, without even sharpening its end. They should have done this in vain, of course, because a second later one of them fell into eternal sleep, and the ordinary branch turned into an extraordinary one. But the forest guests could do nothing, and silently watched as their comrade fell down dead with a branch in his forehead. Fear, misunderstanding, and anger were reflected on the face of the recently smiling man, but now he no longer felt like joking. They arrived, but the uninvited guest didn't know exactly what to do. There was no point in running. He'd catch up. Hiding wasn't an option either. He'd find them. That was already obvious. They'd probably fight. But how was the question? And the reason for this behavior was also clear as day. It was unlikely that anyone had gotten into the habit of watching an ordinary tree branch transform before their eyes into an energetic, magical arrow. But the boy didn't even blink an eye. He just pulled the bowstring and fired. He didn't even consider that he could miss, and he didn't miss. And then everything was painfully banal. Another uninvited guest falls dead to the ground, and the last one understands that he took on this task in vain. Oh, in vain. He, of course, wanted to believe that there was still a chance to change everything. If he tried, if he gritted his teeth, if luck smiled on him, but it did not smile. To put it mildly, she didn't smile. She turned her back to him and to the one below, and his comrades one after another fell dead down. The layout was so-so, it was definitely impossible to get a winning combination. So the man raised his hands and began pitifully asking not to kill him, because he was good, or at least could be. But the young man didn't believe this fairy tale. He had his own philosophy of life. If you're trying to kill someone, then be prepared to die. Everything was extremely simple and clear, so he easily killed the last uninvited guest. The Moor has done his job. The Moor can sleep soundly. He left no traces, destroyed the corpses, took the dummy child. Beauty. True, all this did not make him joyful and happy, because the real world was not as wonderful as Darien told him. The human world, in his humble opinion, was too boring, too predictable, too ordinary. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, a secret meeting was taking place. They weren't making any sacrifices, but they were discussing an interesting topic about creatures imbued with demonic energy. It's a good thing they couldn't break through the barrier and leave the root forest. This was definitely a plus of the situation. The minus was that the forest occupied a large territory. But no one could use this territory if they did not want to die prematurely. Although, on the other hand, this is how you can get rid of unwanted people. Send them to the forest, and you don't have to dirty your hands in someone else's blood. The demonic energy will kill them itself. This was the decision, and the mother and her newborn son were caught in the crossfire, whom the good servants of the church carried into the forest on a dark night. not listening to the woman's pleas for mercy because the seed of darkness had sprouted inside this child. They were not moved by the pleas of the unfortunate woman. They were not moved by the tears of the baby. They performed their rituals under the cover of night in a deserted place. A bright light illuminated the clearing, and the tear-stained face of a once beautiful woman who stretched out her arms to her child, but could not help him. It was too late. The root forest was not a place to escape from. Even the most brilliant mages and warriors were unable to break the ring of fate and return from the forest to their normal lives. It is not surprising that this place became a purgatory for sinners on earth. Church ministers teleported those who were objectionable there with magic, and if by some miracle someone manages to leave the root forest, then all their sins will be forgiven. But it is clear that there have been no precedents. Even if someone tried very hard, nothing would work out. But one day, an unusual child was born, an original sin with the seed of darkness inside. And so Helmut lies in the root forest, crying, and that's all. After all, he was only a couple of months old, maybe less, and he didn't know how to do anything except cry. He lay and lay, crying, languishing from cold and hunger, and there was not a single living soul around, except for the demonic energy penetrating his little body. But the more of this energy became in his body, the more chances he had to survive, because a force awakened within him that enveloped his small body in a cocoon and did not allow him to freeze to death. For 10 long days the baby remained alone in the terrible forest, when suddenly a huge predatory cat appeared in the clearing. And if you think that the cat ate him, you are deeply mistaken. She decided to take Helmut with her. This became a turning point in the boy's fate. And now 10 years have passed, the child is growing healthy, strong, and fast. Living side by side with a predatory cat, who replaced his mother, the child adopted her habits and learned to hunt. We must give the child his due. He was an excellent student. Today, he even managed to catch a hare. Elga watched with a satisfied expression the progress of her human cub, who had already become like family to her. Helmut passed his exam for today, although he only mastered hunting hares and rabbits, but he still had a lot of time ahead of him. Suddenly, Elga pulled out a core from the animal, which was in every demonic beast, and then said that if you eat it, you can restore strength and prolong life. The boy really wanted to try this delicacy, but instead of a kernel, he got a tail on the neck because Elga had completely different plans. She didn't think that the cub was so stupid because he was a human, and in the root forest, but he was a human, which meant that if he ate the core of a demonic beast, he would turn into one himself. The cat was not going to allow this because Helmut would one day have to leave the forest, and if he became a demonic beast, he would not be able to do this. The problem was that the boy didn't believe that he would ever be able to leave the forest, so he thought it was better to become stronger right now and not torment himself with false hopes. But Elda had a different opinion. For some reason, she was convinced that Helmut would one day be able to leave this place. Yes, no one had yet been able to leave this forest, but that didn't mean anything, because there was a man here who shared a secret with her. It was possible to escape from here. Surprise! Helmut did not expect that here, besides him, there was another person, the same as he, two-legged. What if he is still alive? And if so, then you can meet him, you can talk, you can learn about the human world. Elga didn't believe it because people don't live long. Yes, that man used to be very strong, but at their last meeting he had aged greatly. He must be 90 years old, and the demonic energy compresses and binds all the forces within a person. But the boy doesn't feel it, only because of the seed of darkness within. But the main character didn't really listen to her and wanted to go look for that mysterious person who knew how to get out of the forest. Therefore, as soon as the boy found out the direction in which to look for that person, he ran as fast as the wind to see his own kind. And so, on the wings of midday and anticipation, the boy ran to the indicated place. And in the indicated place, instead of a person, there was a high wooden fence. Curiosity got the better of him, and the main character, not paying much attention to propriety, jumped over the fence, and there was a house. The child had never seen anything like it in his life. It is obvious that no demonic beast, no monster could have done such a thing, which means it is the work of human hands. But he rejoiced too soon, because at that very second someone pressed him to the ground and pressed him painfully, very painfully. The man did not stand on ceremony with the uninvited guest. His blow was like a mini explosion in an open area. There was not a drop of friendliness in this monster-like person. One continuous negativity and suspicion like, "Who sent you, cub?" True, there was a mistake here. The boy came himself and did it of his own free will and desire. And anyway, the boy wouldn't have come if Elga hadn't revealed to him a little secret about there being another person living here. The name of the foster mother cat sounded like a spell. and the man let the boy go, otherwise he might die. The man let the boy go, but he no longer trusted him, so he asked why the child had come to him. It was an interesting movie, but the man didn't consider himself an actor in a popular TV series, so he asked the child to look for someone else just to watch it. He didn't need that. But Helmet did not give up. He was not going to leave, because more than anything in the world he wanted to leave this forest. There was nothing to do but introduce myself. The menacing gray-haired man's name was Darian. Although the boy looked at his new acquaintance with an offended expression, he gave his name. There was nowhere to go. A strange child. Darian didn't know how to react to his actions and words, so he wanted to make sure he hadn't misheard and that the boy really wanted to leave the forest. He hoped in vain that the child would renounce her words and run away. He only gained even more courage and confidence because Elga could not lie to him, which meant that the man knew how to leave this place. But Darian didn't understand why he should do this, because the world beyond the forest wall was not a fairy tale world with pink unicorns. But the boy didn't know what kind of world there was outside this forest, so he really wanted to know about what he had only heard. Yes, people did not have sharp fangs and claws, they were not as fast and strong as demonic beasts. But they were no less dangerous because treachery, betrayal, hatred, intrigue are the main weapons in the outside world. I wonder if the boy was born in the forest or transported here. Helmet confirmed the second option. This meant only one thing. Deep in the boy's body, almost at the very heart, at the edge of his soul, a seed of darkness had sprouted. The man understood a lot more than that. If the boy was spared and sent away, then he was from a wealthy family at the very least, and a nobleman at the most. On the other hand, when you live in this forest, regalia and origin no longer matter much. Here you either live or die. Helmet must realize that he is not like all the other people. That is why they sent him here, because they did not want any extra problems for themselves. And if the guy does decide to leave the forest, he will not be accepted in the outside world. He will be constantly bullied, insulted, and ultimately he will die in battle with another person. After hearing this, will this strange boy really still want to go out into the outside world? Darian had hoped in vain to frighten the protagonist, even though he was still a child. But his will was unshakable, as his gaze spoke eloquently. It was obvious to Darian that his plan to intimidate had failed, so he grabbed the boy under his arm and carried him toward the house. After all, the boy grew up with Elga in the forest and hardly resembled a representative of people, so he had a lot to learn along the way. And on this difficult path, Darian was going to help the guy become an ordinary person. But the boy needed everything right here and now, although no one was going to give it to him, because Helmet was not ready to pass through a special magical barrier. And in order to survive in the human world, the boy needed to become 100 times stronger, and then find a person who knew the right path. Becoming stronger sounded promising, but Helmet didn't yet understand how to achieve this, and couldn't imagine what awaited him in the future. But the boy didn't have to reinvent the wheel himself. The main thing was to do everything the man told him to do, and then luck would take care of it. But as soon as they were inside the house, the child's torment began. He did not understand why he had to sweep the floor, or any of this, since there was no one to teach him the basics of home improvement before. Cleaning was just the beginning. Then Darian made the boy a bed on which he would now sleep. It was so comfortable that the child, who was not used to something like this, wanted to lie down longer and rest a little. As expected, the man did not appreciate this idea and ordered the boy to get up immediately, as they still had a lot to do today. As soon as Helmet stood up, his torment continued. It was time to put on normal, but extremely uncomfortable clothes. Tearing them was strictly forbidden, since there were no others. And so they left the house and went about their business. For the demonic beasts, everything was fine here. But for people, things were much more complicated, so Darian was going to show the child what he could eat and what he couldn't. But the main science was to make something edible from something inedible. And to do this, you need to learn to think. So, each root vegetable had a core, which meant that the vegetable itself was contaminated with demonic energy. But in this forest, there was something that this very energy could not influence. And this magical substance was water. It was with its help that one could cleanse root vegetables from demonic energy if they were thoroughly washed in a stream. For the boy, this was a small miracle, since the root vegetable, after being washed in water, was not only clean but also edible, and, what's more, also tasty. The training didn't end there. The third stage was no less strange than the second, with cleaning. The man forced the child to carry water home. Helmet perceived this not as a science of human life, but as a perverted punishment or mockery. At that moment, Elga jumped out of nowhere and scared the boy so much that he spilled the water. It was strange for the cat to see Helmet so obedient, because he practically never listened to her and did as he wanted. The child's behavior was understandable, since the man had promised to make him stronger so that he could leave the forest. Besides, no matter how you look at it, he wasn't a demonic beast, so he needed to live among his own kind. Elga didn't deny that she had said this herself, but did the boy really think that the outside world would be better than here? Helmet didn't know what would be better, but he couldn't help but try to change his fate, so he was going to study hard. He didn't see that his words broke the big, warm heart of the wild cat, for whom he had become a beloved kitten, even though he was a human. But no matter how much pain she felt now, Elga decided to let him follow his heart and left. Meanwhile, Darien continued to train the boy, focusing on strengthening his body and endurance. Helmet was very tired, angry, but did not give up, as he did not plan to stay in this forest forever. Interestingly, the boy held up very well, and it wasn't just the seed of darkness, there was something elusive about him that was worth the time spent learning. It was impossible to train all day long, so at sunset they sat down to eat by the fire. It was unusual for the boy to eat with a spoon, but once he tried the dish, even the spoon did not stop him from gobbling up the deliciousness with both cheeks. The ordinary soup seemed like food for the gods to Helmet, which caused the stern man to smile slightly. True, Darien was in no hurry to eat himself. Instead, he gathered his hair into a low ponytail and was about to show the boy something interesting. Since Helmet had neither fangs nor teeth, and he had to be able to defend himself, they would begin fencing lessons from tomorrow. And then, that very day came, Darien demonstrated to the boy his skills, which were more like an exquisite sword dance than a deadly weapon. Suddenly, the atmosphere changed dramatically. The movements became more abrupt and jerky, and then there was a blow of extraordinary precision and force. If you think that this was the end, then you are mistaken, because lightning suddenly flashed out of nowhere, although there was not a single cloud in the sky. And there was lightning, although no, it wasn't lightning, but Darien's sword sparkled like lightning, making its master invincible. And then another small miracle happened. The hard, indestructible stone began to crack after being struck by a sword. A second, 2, 3, and the huge stone shattered into thousands of pieces before the eyes of the boy, who could not believe that an ordinary person was capable of such a thing. A deathly silence hung over the clearing near the house, and only the boy's heartbeat broke it from time to time. Darien did all this for a reason. The boy had to understand how people were able to survive in this treacherous forest. But the realization never came to Helmet. He could not understand what he had witnessed, how this could be possible, and what it was at all. It was the Force, the source of human energy, similar to the demonic energy that fuels monsters. Yes, a seed of darkness was growing inside the boy, but the power was also in him, although it was a little different from the power of other people. This news was from the obvious and incredible section, but the main character was eager to master the Force. Such zeal could be considered commendable, but the boy's body was not yet ready for it, because even a small flick almost made him fall. Although it was a shame, the boy had to start his warrior's path small, namely by first understanding the essence of the blade. But if a boy sets out on this path, he will experience pain and tears. He will languish in the heat, his clothes will smell of sweat, and his body will ache from tension. But if Helmet can put his whole soul and heart into the blade, if he becomes one with it, then one day the blade will not only become his best friend, but will also reward him for all his efforts. This speech was incredibly heartfelt, so the boy, confident that he was doing the right thing, took the sword into his hands. He was ready to challenge himself and the whole world, to prove that he was capable of much, and would bend the changing world to suit himself. But the boy's composure didn't last long. During yet another training session, he began to get upset, be capricious, and treat his mentor disrespectfully. Helmet thought he was doing everything right, that he had become stronger. So why did Darien think he was still not ready for anything interesting? And in general, the boy can't read eyes. And he can't get into someone else's head, so everything needs to be explained to him so that he understands and does the right thing, and not just scold him for mistakes. The more they trained and spent time together, the man increasingly realized how capable but lazy and wayward his student was. The boy was strange, because everyone knows that the seed of darkness makes people bloodthirsty and cruel. And besides, he was raised by a demonic beast. But Helmet surprised with his rationalism, resilience, and determination. This made him different from others. And if so, then he would definitely be able to succeed, so Darien decided to clearly show him what he wanted to achieve from him now. 2, not the strongest blows, were enough to show how weak the guy still was, and that he still had a lot to learn. It was important to the man that the boy understood the difference, but he thought only about the pain, and nothing else. Apparently, Helmet really wanted to go without dinner today, and perhaps without breakfast either. It worked. The boy tried to stop the teacher, saying that he seemed to understand everything. The point was that the blows were of different strengths, in different places, and delivered at different speeds. Although perhaps this was not the case because, if you think about it, the teacher's movements were the same. That was the point. Stupid and thoughtless repetition of the same movements is not the main thing. The art of fencing was more complex than this. You have to take into account the tension of your muscles, the trembling of your fingertips, the speed of your movement, and most importantly, achieve a balance between your mind and body. During training, the boy must learn to achieve maximum control over all of the above. Only when Helmet puts a part of his soul and heart into every move will he be able to fully understand everything and be ready to move on. And now the boy swings his sword not like a skilled swordsman, but like a rough forester with an axe in a dense forest. Like it or not, the boy had to continue training under the man's close supervision. After some time, Darien took pity on Helmet and let him go to rest. But left alone, the boy did not know what to do. He was bored. At that moment, Elga came gracefully and smoothly to visit him. The boy was glad to see her. The cat couldn't take her eyes off the boy. She couldn't understand when he had managed to grow so much. Although, on the other hand, Elga understood that her baby would grow up to be a handsome and strong man. It turned out that a long time ago, Darien asked the cat for permission to live here, and she allowed it. So until now the man considered himself in her debt. The boy found it strange that she did not fight with him. He shouldn't have said that because Elga got angry, because she was the ruler of the central lands of the root forest and was ready to fight any creatures who invaded here. Although no, she wouldn't want to meet the nasty snake again. Once was more than enough. At that time, Darien was one of the two-headed serpent's targets, so no matter who came out the winner in the fight between man and cat, Naho would take advantage of it. This was understandable, but it remained unclear who would win, the cat or Darien, if they had fought then. Elga had no answer to her charge's question, so she lay down next to him and looked thoughtfully into the distance. She thought for a long time, but finally began to speak. It turned out that demonic beasts are shrouded in an aura of demonic energy, but people can hide their power, so it is extremely difficult to determine its level. This gave the boy the idea that the cat might lose the fight if it took place, but Elga didn't know how things would have turned out then, because Nako hated Darien and really wanted to annoy him, since he destroyed one of his zones in his domain. Until today, Helmet hadn't heard anything about it, so he was curious about what kind of disgusting areas Naho had. There was nothing else to do, so Elga allowed the boy to saddle her and ran in the direction of the serpent's lands. The picture that opened before Helmet's eyes was terrifying. There was a settlement below. People were mocking each other, and this place was called the slave farm. This was not what the boy expected to see. It was beyond his childish understanding of how people could treat their own kind in such a way. Many men were very tired. Their legs could no longer support them. But the overseer with the whip did not care much, and that is how people turned into monsters. The blows from the whip began to rain down on the young man's head like snow during a snowfall, but he could not get up, even though the executioner demanded that he do so. Helmet did not understand the human laws of the jungle. It was strange to watch how someone unknown was beating a man, not paying attention to his suffering. For some reason, the boy couldn't bring himself to call the executioner a human, even in his mind. He was anything but. At the same time, the biped turned his attention to the girls. They walked in orderly rows in the direction of one of the houses, but they could not be called happy, and they looked, in the opinion of the main character, strange. After all, up until that moment he had never seen girls, so he understood that they were very different from him, but he didn't understand why. But the worst news was that they had not entered the huts without a reason. They were soon destined to become dinner for the serpent. Nako generally did not like men, and preferred women, since their meat was much more tender, and they had much less muscles. There was just one small problem. If they were eaten right now, there would be almost no meat on the bones, so first they would be fattened up, and then Naho would feast on them. This is where the women's suffering ends, but men are much less fortunate, since they work on the farm their entire lives until they leave this mortal world, as slaves, and the treatment they receive is not the best. This is how these scary places function, and Naho also protects these farms from monster attacks, and the men supply him with women, meaning food. But it is not only the snake that leads all this bedlam, but among the people there is a leader, Sir Arago, who keeps order. They feared him no less than Naho himself, because so much depended on him. So the overseers fawned over him, reporting that they had collected all the victims for the demonic beast. Suddenly, Arago turned his attention to the girl with green hair. She was less fortunate than the others. It would be better if Naho ate her than become a toy of this old man. And this is exactly what she was destined for. No one dared to object to the man. Everyone remained silent, heads bowed, while he dragged the unfortunate girl to his lair. This shouldn't have been surprising, since Erigo was a mage, and not just any mage, but someone who could find people in the forest, and when he found them, he dragged them to the farms. The main character could also become one of his victims. The boy understood everything. Although no, he could not understand this subhuman. He treated others like trash under his feet, without experiencing pangs of conscience. He didn't want to think about it. Besides, Elga raised him and didn't give him to his relatives, who were worse than the noble demonic beast. But the boy didn't know why she did this. The cat didn't know how to answer the question of practically her kitten, because she didn't want to reveal her true feelings, so she told a half-truth, saying that she didn't want to increase the army of the serpent's slaves. On the one hand, it sounded a little implausible, but on the other, it was awfully similar to Elga. On this note, Elga wanted to finish her introductory tour into the world of other people in the forest. Suddenly, something went definitely wrong. A smell. A pungent, unpleasant, familiar smell of danger and dark forces reached the cat's nose. It is obvious that the nasty and evil Naho has arrived at the clearing in person with very eloquent intentions. At that moment, Elga realized that there had been a mistake. She had thought that the serpent was hibernating, but he was awake, so she had to protect the boy from him by any means necessary. For Helmut, it was a day of discovery. For the first time, just the sight of the snake was causing him a strong, indescribable pressure. And there was a reason for it, because Nako made it clear that he wouldn't mind eating the boy right now because children, boys, are very tasty, no worse than women. The advantage was that the snake had no open intention of conflicting with the cat, and Erigo had raised select people for his meals. But problems came from unexpected places. Naho smelled the familiar scent of Darien on the main character, and the question arose as to how the child was connected to the man. The boy was too afraid to say a word, and he had nothing to say anyway. The truth was not an option here, so Elga came to the rescue and began to protect him from the serpent. Anger, pure, uncontrollable, dictated by fear for the boy, took hold of the cat. She was still warning the enemy not to touch him, but she could at any moment move from words to actions. Nako wasn't stupid. He immediately realized that it was better to avoid open conflict, because you never know what could happen. So far, he was only interested in why the child's clothes had Darian's scent on them, and whether they were connected. The creeper had not yet forgotten how one fine day, a man destroyed one of his favorite slave farms. Elga hadn't thought about the smell either, so she had to make up a story on the fly about Helmut stealing clothes from a man. Nothing more. It was hard to believe, but the snake decided to take the cat's word for now, even though he wanted to punish the main character, but not so much to feel the teeth of an old acquaintance on his own skin. For now, Naho was in a good mood, so he hoped that the uninvited guest would leave his territory and never come here again. After all, in the future he won't be so kind and understanding, and he really wouldn't want to collect white wool from around the area. After this, Nako proudly left, and the boy's nerves gave way and he lost consciousness. This was understandable, but still, Elga didn't think that Helmut was so weak. Less than 6 months had passed before the boy came to his senses, and they were returning home. Kat was very worried. She understood that Naho now knew about the boy, so he couldn't go anywhere alone. Yes, Naho wouldn't dare to openly enter her lands, but that doesn't mean anything, and caution won't hurt. Helmut himself understood this, so he did not protest, but walked quietly and somewhat sullenly next to Elga. Yes, it wasn't his fault what happened, but he was tormented by one question. Could he ever become as strong as Kat and Darien? The question was difficult, and Elga didn't know how to answer it correctly. But she admitted that the man was strong, even very strong. Besides, most people never dream of such heights, even if they put in all their efforts and dedicated their whole lives to it. But even if this was so, Elga believed in the boy, because everything depended only on him, on his determination and strength of spirit. It was also obvious that if Helmut wanted to leave this forest, he would have to give it his all and become stronger, much stronger. Suddenly, Elga smelled Darien, so she decided to leave the boy with him and walked forward proudly, wagging her tail. And indeed, she was not mistaken. A few moments later, a man appeared in the clearing with an armful of brushwood and straw. Darien did not focus his attention on the boy's adventures and suggested going into the house to rest, since night was approaching. It was a great idea, but at some point the boy felt that Elga was looking at him. The cat was giving him a silent promise to always be invisibly close by and protect him from adversity. Night fell, but it could not be called calm and quiet. The boy was writhing on the bed from severe pain in his stomach. With each passing minute, the pain became stronger and stronger, and the child had practically no strength left to endure it. Helmut involuntarily remembered how Darien had slipped him some grass, saying that he should definitely chew it before going to bed. At that moment, the main character did not attach much importance to the fact that this was a special herb, poisonous. Slowly, the meaning of what was said reached the boy, and he tried to protest, but it was no use. The man was stronger. One flick was enough for him to convince the child that he was right, and the grass should have suppressed the seed of darkness inside the boy for a while. And now, the unfortunate protagonist thought that at any moment he would leave this world, because not only his stomach, but his entire small body was hurting. But no matter how much the boy screamed and complained, Darien did not hear him, because he had left and was peering into the darkness of the night, looking into the eyes of the lonely moon. Morning came. No matter how lousy the boy felt at night, he was now cheerful and continued his training. Amazingly, Helmut made great strides, demonstrating enviable persistence each time. True, the trees suffered from his efforts. They were all slashed by blows from the wooden sword. Darien was pleased with what he saw because it meant that Helmut liked fencing and was determined. This was true, and magically the boy's vision improved, and his body was now much more obedient, miracles and nothing more. Although the main character had a hunch that it was due to poisonous grass, demonic grass to be precise, he no longer had stomach pains, and what's more, Helmut was more cheerful, and getting up early no longer bothered him. Several months passed like this, and Darien decided that it was time to move on to a new stage of training. It was about the force. It could not be seen, touched, or smelled. It did not exist in the physical world. Therefore, it was infinite. But if a person's body is weak and unprepared, the force cannot be used. So until now, the man had not taught the boy the basics of its use. But now he can try. Today was the right day when Helmut's mind and body were ready to accept the force and use it adequately. From that day forward, and for as long as necessary, Darien intended to train the boy in the force. And in order for Helmut to understand what awaited him, the man evened out his breathing, and the incredible happened. An unstoppable, powerful force raged around him. So the man said that the boy needed to absorb the surrounding energy and then redirect it. The energy must be transferred to the protagonist's blade, after which it must be enchanted. That was the whole point of power. It all depended on how and for what people used it. The theory was finished. Now it was time to move on to practice. So the boy must first feel his blade and lift it. During battle, Helmut must maintain his breathing, its pace and frequency, because he needs to absorb the surrounding energy. During a fight, you always need to fight with a cool head, be absolutely calm, then his movements will be light and clear. And then the man decided to clearly show what would happen if the boy lost his pace, what would happen to his strength. Helmut was able to withstand the blow, but he realized that strength can be forgotten if one forgets composure. But this was not enough, and Darien continued to attack the main character. His blows were unusually strong. The boy was barely able to jump aside. Within minutes of such a frantic pace, the boy's endurance began to fail him, and he even began to think that the man wanted to kill him. But no one was going to give Helmut any breaks, so he had to even out his breathing to avoid dying prematurely. And now he was calm, which meant he could try to attack the man, not just dodge the blows. It looked funny. Darien didn't even move from his place, didn't use slew anymore, but easily repelled all of the child's attacks. All of this was definitely not enough to get to the man even a little. The boy needed to absorb as much energy as possible and summon Sulu. Yes, no one could be perfect the first time, but the problem was that Helmut wanted it, but didn't know how, so he backed down. He needed to be prepared for the fact that from now on, all training would be like this, and it didn't matter how much time he had to spend on them to get the desired result. On the one hand, it sounded like a threat, but on the other, it motivated the boy and he attacked the teacher again. Oh, that was the best thing Helmut had ever shown his mentor. That last blow contained all his determination to become stronger and leave this place, though it didn't quite achieve its goal. The training continued day and night. The number of days was no longer particularly important, until one day Helmut was able to call upon the force. From that day on, his life became more interesting. He applied his new skills not only for training, but also in everyday life. For example, chopping wood in the winter. Although the boy had grown up and become a young man over the past 4 years, he still considered himself too weak, although it was not outwardly noticeable. Darien watched him closely and was not even against a duel, but before it began, he wanted to see the strength of his protege. This made the protagonist nervous because the last time, after a similar offer, Darien refused the duel, calling him weak. But there was nothing to be done, and he had to show the force. Darien was once again surprised by how talented a student he had, because despite the Seed of Darkness, he demonstrated insane growth. Helmet was definitely destined to turn the world upside down, but it was difficult to say in what way this would happen. But they will think about this tomorrow, or they will not think about it at all. But they can't delay any longer. The guy is ready for a new stage in his life. It's obvious that with this level of power, Helmet will be able to pass through the barrier, so it's time to say goodbye. The protagonists both believed and did not believe that the time had come for him to leave this damned forest. Now he felt fear, and he didn't understand why now, because he was not yet strong enough, but everything was simple. If the Seed of Darkness grew even deeper in him, then he would not be able to pass through the divine barrier. Only now the guy must turn into an ear and be very attentive because he will only have one chance. So, the path to the human world was in the north of the root forest. To get there, you need to pass through the divine barrier. There was one place where this barrier had become especially weak recently. In theory, Helmet should be able to reach that place and leave the forest through it. But this is only in theory. In practice, no one has ever done this. But we need to act decisively now, before the Seed of Darkness begins to hinder the protagonist, and he can break through the barrier. There was another problem. Darien had never looked for this place, but he knew a man who did. And that man was Erugo, who lived on the Naho slave farm, which is pretty news if you think about it. This could be accepted. The main thing was to achieve the goal. But Darien was worried about Helmet, because he had lived his whole life in the forest, and my people would seem like a fairy tale to him. But you need to remember that they are the ones who are followed by tragedy. You can't hide from them or run away. They will always find a guy everywhere. One day it may seem that the world has collapsed, that it is pulling him into the abyss of despair and darkness. But no matter what happens, no matter what trials the protagonist faces, he must always remain true to himself and never forget who he really is. This was obvious, but the boy was worried about whether Darien was really not going to go with him to the human world. Unfortunately, the mentor confirmed Helmet's fears. He was going to stay in the forest forever. Right now, he wanted to rest a little, but he was expecting Helmet to visit tomorrow. He had something important in store for the guy. There was something vaguely strange about the man wanting to spend some time alone. Night fell. Helmet did not go home, since the mentor wanted to be alone. So he sat on the edge of the cliff and looked at the river below. Feeling that the main character was not feeling well, Elga came to him. She was interested in what was supposed to happen tomorrow, since the guy was so sad and worried. Yes, tomorrow he had to leave the forest, but for some reason an incomprehensible weight lay like a stone on his heart. This was a normal phenomenon. Elga was sure that it indicated that the guy was slowly becoming a real person. The night did not last forever, and in the morning Helmet came to the house, but he was afraid to open the door for the first time. But Elga did not let him give in, and forced him to open the door, where his mentor was waiting for him in the darkness and silence. Darien was in no hurry to break the silence, but in front of him lay some kind of bundle and a sword. A real sword. It was a gift, and it was a farewell. Darien could not say anything to Helmet. He died. It was the first farewell in the boy's life, the first death of a loved one. He did not fully understand what had happened, but he knew that it was time for him to leave this house. He didn't cry, took the gift, and promised to always, wherever he was, remember Darien and all his instructions. Elga waited for the main character near the house. He didn't leave, as she understood that he needed support, and also knew that all people die. And now it was the man's turn to go to a better world. Darien lived a good, long, rich, meaningful life, so there is no need to be sad, because for people it is a luxury to live so long. Not only did Darien have a gift for the boy, but the cat also gave him a package containing a medallion, which was the one the boy was wearing when he entered the forest. It was made of pure gold, or another precious metal, which meant that the guy was born into an aristocratic family. But the most interesting thing was the engraving and the name Margaret Irene. Now that was interesting. Perhaps that was the name of the main character's mother, or maybe his sister, or even his grandmother. Elga was sure that Helmet would need to find this Margaret, because she had a feeling that this woman would help him no matter what. Today she couldn't go to the slave farm with Helmet because Nako was still sleeping. But if she appeared near the farm, he would definitely wake up. It was clear enough, but Helmet was no longer a frightened boy. Today he could definitely handle everything on his own. It was time to leave. But nevertheless, the main character slowed down and wished his mother cat a long life. But now it was definitely time for him to start a new chapter in his life, so he confidently moved forward. The boy walked and thought about how many weak and not very talented wizards turned to dark magic for help, which made them much stronger than they were. Among the magicians, there were those who were ready to practically sell their souls to the devil and commit the most unthinkable acts and crimes. They mocked other people, tortured them, and then sacrificed them to the dark forces just to become stronger. All his adult life, Arugo hated and envied other magicians. He felt that he was not good enough and did not have enough talent to stand next to the best of the best, so he turned to the dark forces. But for dark magic to work properly, it needs to be fueled by people's negative emotions. It's a good thing that the slave trade flourished in the human world, so there were no problems with materials for sacrifices. Surprisingly, the suffering and horror that the magician received from his victims made him more powerful and evil. He did not feel guilty and continued to mock ordinary people for a long time, but one day good wizards uncovered his crimes and made them public to the world. Obviously, no one was going to leave the matter to its own devices, so Arago was captured and brought to trial, with the choice being between execution and exile. It is clear that the magician did not want to die, so he agreed to spend the rest of his life in the root forest. But when the wizard got into the cursed forest, he realized that he had made a mistake. But nevertheless, after a short search, he found there a temple of a two-headed serpent, where he begged the monster to take patronage over him in exchange for human sacrifices. And in this world, the magician used his powers to gather exiled people and win them over to his side, thus creating a slave farm, and Arugo became the boss of it. Yes, the true master of these lands was Naho, but he never interfered in human affairs. As long as the victims continued to come, everything else was unimportant to him. Oddly enough, this was the starting point for the revival of the magician's hidden ambitions. Now, he again wanted to regain his former greatness. However, every winter was a terrible ordeal for the man, as Naho hibernated and other demonic beasts attacked the farm, killing the serpent's precious food. But even in such difficult times, despite all his fears, Arago got real pleasure from watching other people suffer. But now he needed to think not about the snake or about other demonic beasts, but about the man who had the tip of a sword stuck to his neck. The protagonist wasn't particularly concerned with the man's worries right now, because he needed an answer to the question of how to get out of the forest, so it was better for the mage to cooperate with him if he wanted to stay alive. Arago was in no hurry to share his secrets and tried to change the subject, saying that he knew that Darien had a student, but he didn't know that this student was such an impudent boy. But the main character wasn't going to fall for this trick. He wanted answers, and nothing more, from this man. The magician didn't fully understand the complexity of the situation until the main character pressed the point of the sword against his neck. Well, even in this situation, the man tried to scare the young man by saying that if he died, Naho would immediately wake up from hibernation. But this did not frighten the guy, because in this case, the magician would still die. The man scared the boy, but the protagonist was not one to be timid, because Naho does not know how to resurrect the dead, and Arugo will die and nothing else will matter. Therefore, it would be better for the man to accept his fate and tell everything to the young man in a good way, because he might find out everything in a bad way. Arago started bargaining, but it didn't have the desired effect, because Helmet knew very well that magicians have a bad habit of writing everything down. So if he searched the magician's house thoroughly, he would find what he needed. At that moment, it became clear that the boy was diehard, so the man had no choice but to agree. It was, of course, unpleasant for the magician to realize that some child had outplayed him, but there was nothing he could do, and he led him to the dungeon where the most important records were kept. To lighten the somewhat oppressive atmosphere, the magician decided to tell the boy some information. The method he had found was pure theory. No one had the courage to test it, and all the boy's efforts could sink into oblivion. If anyone could handle this impossible task, it would be Darien. But since the guy was alone here, Arago concluded that the man was not going to leave the forest, although anything could have happened, perhaps he even died, which could not but please him, because they had never been friends, rather the opposite. Nevertheless, the magician took out an ancient tome from the shelf, although he did it extremely reluctantly, and he was in no hurry to hand the book over to the main character, and moreover, he offered Helmet to become his student. This proposal was extremely uninteresting for the boy, because all he needed was to get the treasured book and leave this cursed place, which he considered his prison. Arago didn't understand the hints. He thought that all the people around him were very weak and worthless. But if the guy agreed to become his student, he would give him everything he had, and not just this book. But this show didn't make any impression on the main character. He was going to take the book and get out of the forest alive. As offensive as it was, the magician had to come to terms with the guy's decision and give him the book. In general, the wizard who found a way to leave the forest believed that success lay in the use of stealth magic. However, he failed to escape. According to the book, there is a huge waterfall in the north. It contains demonic energy, a divine barrier, and neutral water at the same time, and that is where the barrier is weakest. However, even if this is so, this does not change the fact that the barrier is divine magic of the highest order. It will incinerate any creature even slightly imbued with demonic energy. So, the book was in the hands of the main character. He needed to decide what to do with the magician. On the one hand, he really didn't like him. But Helmet still remembered the words of his mentor about not thoughtlessly disposing of someone else's life, even if he really doesn't like someone. Therefore, it seemed to him that the best way out of this situation was to beat Erigo, tie him up, and block his magic. The man was not so much angry at the fact that the guy had beaten him, but at the fact that he had dared to block his magic. So the best thing the man could think of was to use his secret techniques and summon the sleeping snake. Yes, Naho appeared in the dungeon, but he was clearly not happy that the magician woke him up. So he hoped that he had a good reason to do this, because otherwise, he would not care that this man had served him for quite a long time. The man believed that the reason was very, very serious, since none other than the student of the deceased Darien had come here. This news made the snake very happy, because he had a wonderful opportunity to get rid of the inheritance of the man whom he hated with all his black soul. Naho rushed to pursue his prey, and Erigo remained in the dungeon, happy that he had found a way to get even with the protagonist. Meanwhile, Helmet ran at full speed through the forest, realizing that he needed to hurry because his sixth sense was screaming about danger. The boy understood perfectly well that he had to kill the magician because he was too vengeful, and now small demonic beasts that appeared from the awakened serpent were running away from the forest. Suddenly, a wave of energy from another's presence pierced his body, and it frightened him just like the first time, with the only difference being that Helmet did not lose consciousness, but stood firmly on his feet. Yes, he sped up, ran at the limit of his capabilities, but he was still on the lands of Naho. The worst thing was that the entire area was saturated with dark demonic energy, which thickened, condensed, and pressed on everyone around. There was no doubt left. The serpent was approaching and was about to appear in the clearing, so Helmet had no choice but to prepare and accept the fight. Not even a few minutes had passed when a monster appeared in the clearing. It was burning with anticipation of devouring its prey. The moment of truth had arrived. The protagonist had nowhere to run. His heart pounded loudly in his chest, reminding him that he was a man who would have to fight such a powerful opponent for the first time. Surprisingly, Naho even demonstrated a demonic hospitality that was mixed with arrogance. To tell the truth, Naho had been waiting for the young man for a long time, so he had no intention of letting him go anywhere. Just a couple of months ago, the boy would have been scared by this request, but now he was determined to leave the forest, so he was ready to kill the monster in order to move on. But this sounded extremely impudent on his part. The snake did not believe that a child with such a fragile body could harm him. The only thing a person could do was accept his fate and let himself be eaten. Everything else was extremely dubious. And then Naho attacked the young man. It was scary to imagine what happened to the main character after that. And, lo and behold, everything was fine with him. He was able to dodge and was ready to begin the battle. But he couldn't do this yet, since nothing was visible around him. At that moment, a dragon appeared and took the main character into the ring of his body, not giving him the opportunity to escape. The situation was unpleasant, but Helmet needed to catch his breath and calm down, because the opportunity to attack would appear sooner or later. He just had to wait a little. The result was obvious. The guy's gaze became firm, indicating that he was not going to just dodge, but would soon be able to attack. And he turned out to be right, 100% right, because after a few minutes, Naho began to form an energy ball. The snake opened its mouth for this, and this was the opportunity the protagonist had been waiting for. And a moment later, Helmet jumped, found himself on the body of the serpent, and ran forward towards the target. The guy understood perfectly well that no matter how strong the energy he enveloped his body with, Naho had weak points, for example, her eyes, which the guy attacked. Darien had obviously trained the protagonist well, as his strike was perfect, precise, and effective. True, everything was not as good as he would have liked. Yes, the guy bought himself a little time, but he could not kill the enemy. He did not have enough strength. And he had spent too much strength on this blow. Now the best solution was to try to escape while one of the serpent's heads writhed in pain. But the second head didn't care about the pain and sadness of the first head, so it cursed and screamed. And then something incredible happened. The first head devoured the second, without feeling any compassion. Moreover, she was pleased with herself, because she was able to get rid of the useless part of herself. And now it was the person's turn. For now, the guy had enough strength to withstand Naho's pressure, but how much longer he could hold out was unknown. In order to at least catch his breath and not die on the spot, Helmet ran away. Naho was even able to appreciate the trick he had performed, although he understood that after such a blow the person would not be able to hide for long. With one head, finding the snake guy would be more difficult, but not impossible, so he began searching. Meanwhile, a young man was sitting under one of the trees. He knew that Naho was strong, but he didn't think he was that strong, because during the entire fight the guy was only able to land one blow on his opponent. It was sad, but the good thing about the situation was that the guy managed to survive. Now he had to run, because he wouldn't have another chance to escape. But it was not to be, as the guy was pinned to the spot by a strong, dark, demonic energy that emanated from Naho. Helmet naively thought that he could hide and then escape, finding himself in the part of the forest that belonged to the serpent. But Naho was pleased with himself, and now he was able to attack the young man. There was nothing to do. There was no way to run away. The guy understood that he had to accept the fight, because he was going to die here, and Helmet was not going to do this. He was very lucky, because Elga, who came to the aid of her man, covered him with her body. It was an unexpected pleasure, although the boy looked a little confused. The cat was strong and majestic, ready to tear the serpent to pieces if he touched her charge with even a scale. Elga's demonic energy knocked not only the serpent, but also Helmet off their feet. The boy knew that his guardian was strong, but this was more than he expected. She was glad that the main character was able to hold out until she arrived. Now he had to leave. She would take care of the rest. After Darian's death, the boy didn't want to lose Kat too, so he wanted to stay and help her. But this was unnecessary because the guy had to move forward and get the long-awaited freedom that he so passionately dreamed of. Elga growled, dismissing all the boy's doubts, urging him to leave and not waste her strength in vain. It was hard for the main character to make a decision, but he pulled himself together and ran forward. All this seriously angered Nako. He did not understand how Elga dared to interfere with him on his own territory. But the cat believed that she was not bothering the snake, but was doing what her heart told her to do. It's funny. The snake didn't expect the cat to soften so much. That's what friendship and other warm feelings do to the strong of the forest. All this almost made the snake sick, but he was glad that Elga had come to him herself. Now he would have a main course and dessert. But this is unlikely because even with two heads Naho couldn't do it. I wonder how the snake will be able to do it with one head. This became the starting point, and the demonic beasts rushed to attack, trying to bite each other to death. Meanwhile, the main character continued his march towards his designated destination. But his path was complicated by demonic beasts that attacked him endlessly. It seemed as if there was no end to them, but the boy managed to clear his way. Quite a few days had passed since he left the lands of Naho, but things had not become any easier or clearer for him. The only good thing about the situation was that all the demonic beasts that attacked him were much weaker than the serpent, so he was able to deal with them with ease. Only now did Helmut begin to realize that if Elga and Darian had not helped him all this time, he would not have been able to survive in this forest and would have been eaten long ago. So now, looking at the waterfall, he understood that he had to get out of this cage by any means necessary and not let his mentors down. It was also interesting that the lands he found himself in were different from those in which he had lived before. The guy felt almost no demonic energy here, although the seed of darkness did react to something. A sudden thought struck him. Most likely this reaction was caused by the proximity of the divine barrier, so he was lucky that Darian taught him how to hide the seed of darkness with the help of force. Otherwise, he would have had serious problems. Suddenly, a beautiful, white, huge feather fell on his hand. I wonder who this beauty belonged to. The opportunity to get an answer to the question asked appeared unexpectedly, as soon as the boy raised his head to the sky and saw a huge flying demonic beast. It was a huge, beautiful bird and also the lord of these lands. At that moment, the protagonist realized that he had made a small mistake, as he had forgotten that this was the territory of a demonic beast with which he would have to negotiate. But the problem was that Agrella, the ruler of the north, was an extremely curious animal. She could smell a familiar scent on the boy. It was hidden by the stench of blood, but she could still smell it, and it was Naho's scent. But at the same time, the main character had another innate scent, which belonged to the leopard Elga. But the boy didn't care that he had the scent of the snake on him, because he considered himself to be part of the cat's family, which he said with pride. But even after hearing that the protagonist considered himself to be Cat's family, Bird was surprised that he would dare to enter her territory without permission. The only thing was that Elga didn't tell him to come here. He had his own personal reasons for doing so. This surprised Agrella. She could not understand what reasons he could have for coming here, and if he voiced them and they satisfied her, she was ready to spare the guy. Now Helmet needed to pull himself together, because a lot depended on how calm and confident he was. So he exhaled and said that the main reason could help the demonic beast. This reason could help calm Bird's curiosity because he was going to be the first living creature to emerge from the root forest alive. It sounded too implausible because the demonic beast felt the seed of darkness inside the guy and believed that he had long ago become no different from her relatives. However, Helmet asked her permission to try because he was the only person who had gone that far. Therefore, he considered himself more than worthy to try his luck and break the divine barrier, or at least try to pass through it. But Agrella wasn't going to agree, because she knew that human meat was the most delicious, and she didn't want the guy to kill himself on the barrier. But the boy knew that there would always be people in the forest, but the only person who would try to get out of here would be him. Bird couldn't help but acknowledge the young man's eloquence. Now she wanted to see what he could do. After all, it's unlikely that there will be another person so stupid who would risk his life to get out of this damned forest. She didn't care whether the boy survived or not, but if he succeeded, he would become the first person to get out of this forest, and she would witness this miracle. Now Agrella was intrigued and wanted to see it, so she would protect the boy until he got close to the barrier. The bird was ready to fulfill the boy's small request and convey a message from him to the cat. So Helmet asked her to say that he had survived and got out of the forest. Agrella immediately understood that the boy wanted Elga to think that he was alive and well no matter what. It was a simple request that the demonic beast could fulfill, so the boy could move forward with peace of mind. He didn't need to be told twice. He took a deep breath and jumped into the water, realizing that he wouldn't have a second chance. It was hard to breathe. The pressure on his body was too much, but Helmet understood that he had to survive, had to get out for himself, for Elga, for Darien, and see the world beyond this place. It was the action of the divine barrier, that is, the power of purification that protects people from evil energy. And now it passed through the seed of darkness inside the protagonist. Horror and pain pierced the boy's body. He had never experienced anything like it in his life. He didn't know how to endure it, but he understood that he had to do it. Suddenly, the boy's consciousness began to drift away. He didn't know what fate had in store for him. Demonic beasts were turning into people, and people into demonic beasts. Meanwhile, a group of adventurers in the human world were busy completing their next mission, and their path was not far from the root forest. The youngest and newest member of the squad began to whine. He wanted to rest, but Tanya looked at him sternly, since their journey was still long, and she didn't really want to listen to all this. Besides, they could be attacked by demonic beasts at any moment, and they would be lucky if they were weak. But if they were strong, then Pin would have to fight them, so whining was useless. Moreover, regardless of the time of day, everyone had to perform their duties. The guy had to carry water. But Pin resisted, and in vain, because he received a magical boost and went to get water. The area was depressing. The mood was disgusting. I wanted to go home and sleep, and not all this. The river had already appeared ahead. All that was left was to collect some water and return to his comrades, when instead of water, the main character's hair fell into the bucket, and a minute later Pin saw his pale face. This day couldn't have been worse. The boy was overcome with fear, and the most nightmarish and panicky thoughts crept into his head. And then he acted automatically, screamed, ran, screamed even louder, until he reached his commanders, who thought that ghosts were chasing him. This assumption was not far from the truth, as he found a real cold corpse in the river. Nobody believed him. On the contrary, they started laughing, thinking that the guy had mistaken a log for a human being. But he was ready to show where the corpse was. And since it came to that, Tanya gave him a boost and decided to go see what happened by the river. And what was her surprise when Helmet lay unconscious on the shore? He really did look like a corpse, but unlike her subordinate, the girl was brave and decisive, so she looked closely at the guy and realized that he was still breathing. This meant that he had to be retrieved from the water and carried to the camp to provide the necessary first aid. Pin was quite the helper, but he helped drag the guy to the camp and was glad that he was starting to come to his senses. While the picture before Helmet's eyes was swimming, but looking at the people in front of him, he began to realize that he had managed to get out of the root forest, and this was the outside world. It was definitely the outside world, and the people were noisy. They talked and talked about how they had found him by chance and couldn't leave him lying around in the cold water. The whole situation was very intriguing for the adventurers. They were curious about what kind of goldfish they had caught, but the main character decided to pretend he didn't remember anything. Only experienced mercenaries found this strange, because he had no serious external injuries, although he could have hit his head, and anything could have happened there. But this didn't really matter, so Tanya decided to introduce herself and make friends with the guy. This was a kind of sign for the other mercenaries that they could and should be friends with the main character. It turned out that he ended up in the rotting forest, which was located not far from the root forest. But this meant nothing to Helmet. He couldn't tell the truth to people, so he decided to stick to stories about how he remembered his name and how he knew how to wield a sword and nothing more. This was already something, so Tanya decided to take it with her on the road and show it to the doctor, and then we'll see what and how to do. Maybe the memory will return. She was ready to help the main character until he came to his senses and could confidently stand on his own 2 feet. A wave of gratitude washed over the boy, and then came the realization that he had miraculously survived. Just a little more and he would have died. But while his body was weak, he could not use the force, and it would take an indefinite amount of time to restore his form. It was unpleasant to feel as weak as at the beginning of training with Darien, but I'm alive, and thank goodness for that. Besides, the seed of darkness was still in him, although he hoped that the divine barrier would destroy it. But he was out of luck. Although, if you look at the situation from a different angle, if it weren't for the seed of darkness, he would already be dead, so the guy hasn't yet decided whether to be happy or sad. But he will have to talk about his memory loss forever. Because this is the world of people. No one here should know about the seed of darkness, otherwise they will put him back in the forest, which is something he really doesn't want. Yes. And he needs to find the owner of the medallion. What if she is his real mother? Then he will have a chance to find a family. But that's later. And for now, he can enjoy the new, free world into which he took his first step and taste new sensations. A new day had dawned, and if in the evening Helmut attracted attention with his deathly pallor, then in the morning after his bath he looked like a real aristocrat. The guy's appearance involuntarily made Pin, who found him in a half-dead state, envious because no one admired him, even after swimming. The main character had nothing to say to this. He couldn't admit that Elga, a demonic beast, had replaced his mother. But Tanya didn't need any explanations, because Helmut was now just an ordinary newcomer to their team. Besides, they have 4 days left on the road, after which they will arrive in the city, where she will take the guy to the doctor for an examination. Maybe he will tell her how to restore her memory. The time for talking was over. It was time to pack our things and hit the road again. No one wasted any time, and soon all the belongings were collected and the group moved forward. But Pin was worried about his new friend, since he still looked unwell, but still wanted to continue the walk. There was no need to worry too much about the main character, as he believed that the walk would do him good and help him recover his strength faster. And the close proximity of the cute horses also helped. Only Helmut didn't know that horses were horses, so he was a little surprised to learn the name of these charming creatures. But he definitely liked them. The young man's behavior was very alarming to Ping, because on the one hand, he understood that a nobleman would not so openly display his affection for animals. But on the other hand, there was still something wrong with this guy, but he couldn't figure out what it was. And Helmut spoke somehow strangely, and this despite the fact that they were about the same age. The puzzle didn't fit together, that's all. After a while, it became obvious that Helmut had slightly overestimated his abilities, as he began to breathe heavily. So Pin suggested that he get into the cart so as not to slow down the detachment. It was a pleasant concern, but it was not part of the protagonist's plans. He wanted to continue at the same pace as before, because that was the only way he could regain his former form. The unexpected refusal, although so unexpected and quite expected, hurt the blonde, because he had shown sincere support, and Helmut glared at him so angrily that he no longer wanted to talk to him. But the protagonist wasn't particularly concerned about his new acquaintance's emotional distress, as he still hadn't fully recovered. While in the root forest, it took him no more than a day to recover from intense training and battles with monsters. That rule didn't apply here. However, he did not lose heart and believed that if he continued to move forward, sooner or later everything would return to normal. And so they arrived in the city. Tanya, as promised, took the young man to the doctor who, after examining him, came to the conclusion that the guy was absolutely healthy. He had an enviable resilience, which contributes to a quick recovery from any ailment. The girl did not agree with this conclusion and believed that the doctor had examined her new friend poorly, which made the doctor very angry, but he nevertheless prescribed medication. Tanya considered this approach to treating the patient to be quackery, since Helmut had been lying half dead in the river a week ago, from where she had fished him out. And now he remembered nothing, while the doctor insisted that the boy was completely healthy. But the man stood his ground, by and large, no matter how much he looked, no matter what angle he did it from. And the guy was physically healthy and resilient, and he would remain so. This was strange because the guy didn't have any head injuries either. So where did the amnesia come from? That's the question. The doctor had nothing to say in response to this, so he only wrote out a prescription for the medicine and sent the insolent visitors away. There was nothing to do. They took the recipes and walked away. Tanya was very worried about Helmut. Pin told her that sometimes even walking was too difficult for the main character. Yes, this was the pure truth, however. The young man assured that after taking the medication and resting in the apartment, he felt very well. But this was already good, because the girl remembered very well that the guy knew how to use a sword. And according to the doctor, he had no shortage of stamina, which could mean that he had a mentor before. Tanya was close to the truth, but the protagonist could not directly confirm this guess, so he evasively said that when he holds the sword in his hands, he feels it as if it were his own. It sounded intriguing, so the girl, without thinking twice, suggested that Helmut arrange a small duel to test his mettle. The guy even stopped at such an unexpected offer and asked his friend again, not believing that he would be able to separate the bones. Tanya interpreted his reaction in her own way and asked him not to worry, as it would be a short training sparring session, during which he might remember something, or maybe not. Of course, Helmut could have refused. No one forced him to participate, but he figured that since Tanya was a third-rank silver mercenary, society would probably respect such people, so he decided to try his hand. Since everything had already been decided, the girl took the main character to the training ground, where the other mercenaries were training hard. But as soon as they saw Tanya and Helmut appear on the court, they all stopped, realizing that the most interesting part was about to begin, and they could even place small bets. However, they asked to be a little easier on the main character, as it would be a shame if the girl ruined such a beautiful face. It was a shame they didn't say that, because they were the first to get hit in the face. And Tanya, with a sense of accomplishment, was ready to begin the duel with Helmut. So, they will fight with wooden swords. The one who falls to the ground loses. The girl asked only one thing of the young man, that he fight with all his might and not look at the fact that she was a girl, because it was not for nothing that she was nicknamed the vice-captain of their squad. Helmut understood that he was not yet in his best shape, and his strength had not yet returned, so stupid attacks would not help him. He would have to parry and counterattack the girl's attacks. He took a deep breath and pulled himself together, realizing that he couldn't let his guard down for a second. The battle began. It was difficult to understand who attacked first and who defended, nevertheless it looked quite impressive. It was unpleasant to realize, but the girl blocked his attacks with extraordinary ease, even with a cheeky smile on her lips. This only meant that she was much stronger than the guy at this stage. The blows rained down one after another, and Helmut had to dodge, realizing that in an open fight he would lose to her. The plan to evade Tanya's attacks was falling apart. It obviously couldn't continue for much longer. The situation was getting out of control. The young man's body was unable to react according to his plan, and he had already taken several significant blows. And then he didn't have a chance to withstand the aggressive behavior of the girl. He missed another attack, which obviously, if the girl had had a real sword in her hands, would have been fatal for him. He didn't die, he just fell to the ground and slid backwards for several meters. It was obvious that the fight was over, and in this fight the main character lost to Tanya. He simply could not help but admit it. Only the young man's eyes showed that he was very surprised by this outcome of the fight, but he accepted it as his due. Now he could tell that the girl fought a little rougher than his mentor, and yet she gave him a lot of opportunities to counterattack. Her technique was weaker, and her movements were predictable, but he was unable to take advantage of this chance. This suggested that the girl was stronger than he thought, so he had to accept the fact that the human world had to be taken seriously. It was much more complex than it seemed at first glance. The guy's reaction was again misunderstood, so they began to reassure him, saying that Tanya was considered a first-class warrior, so he shouldn't take defeat so seriously. Besides, Helmut held up well, and if he had been a little stronger, the outcome of the fight would have been completely different. It turned out that this was a kind of test, which Helmut passed with his head held high. Finn didn't want to leave the main character alone in the city without memories, so he was going to offer him to become part of his squad, which is what this test was for. Unfortunately, their squad could not accept just anyone, so all members of the group observed and assessed the actions and condition of the young man. Now many things were out of place, and the main character realized that if he had made a mistake somewhere, he would have been left alone. But he was lucky, and the captain welcomed him into his squad with open arms, noting that the guy did not succumb to the charms of his sister and did not try to hit on her, after which he handed the young man the seal of a fourth-rank mercenary, although this seal was temporary and would soon need to be replaced with an official one. Even though it was a temporary document, it was a document that gave the young man a certain confidence in the next day. But he was in no hurry to trust his new comrades, because Darien said that people cannot be trusted. Since you can't trust anyone, you need to consider all possible scenarios, so Helmet asked Finn how much time he needed to spend on his team. The protagonist's question puzzled the captain, as no one had ever thought to ask such a question. After thinking for a moment, he said that no one was keeping anyone there, so the guy could leave at any convenient time, but not while on assignment. Certainly, the situation was developing in the best possible way for Helmet, because now he was not alone. These people looked very reliable, which meant that it was quite possible that they would help him unravel the mystery of his birth. Moreover, he really wanted to know who the comrades were and what they were needed for, because in the root forest, except for Darien, he did not communicate with anyone, not counting, of course, Elga, who was a demonic beast. Training was training, but it was time to earn money, and the mercenaries met with the client, who expressed extreme irritation at the fact that he also had to hire Helmet. But the captain was not one to be timid. He knew how to convince people, appealing to the fact that Helmet was a good swordsman and would be useful on their journey. Mr. Miles had nothing to say, so he agreed to make concessions and take another member onto the team. However, the man had no intention of paying the full amount to the new recruit, as he had not been warned of his appointment in advance. And besides, Avantgarde would have to cooperate with Tariq's group. All the details were discussed, albeit with some scandal. They were supposed to set off on their journey the following morning, but for now, they could rest. Tanya and Finn breathed a sigh of relief. This time, everything went quite smoothly, since the previous times they had been a little less lucky. Helmet also felt very good, although he did not quite understand what was happening. Now it was necessary to discuss the mission itself, the essence of which was that they had to escort valuable cargo, so an ambush from people or monsters was possible. The fourth ranks should not interfere with the others, and engage in combat only in extreme cases. The rest of the crew had to be well prepared, and the captain and vice captain had no idea what kind of valuable cargo they would be escorting this time. So they had to be prepared for any preliminary circumstances. In short, newcomers should get a good night's sleep today and be as alert and fresh as a cucumber tomorrow. In addition, Helmet was given valuable advice not to pay attention to the statements of the guys from Tariq's squad, with whom the Vanguard had a strained relationship. At this point, the briefing and meeting were over. Everyone was free until tomorrow. Free time arrived, and under the cover of the starry night, the young man went out into the training arena. A sea of feelings overwhelmed him. The dominant one was rage, because he was looking for an excuse for himself in a lost battle. But by and large, there were no excuses. It was a shame and bitter to admit that he himself could not keep up with Tanya, who opened up several times specifically so that he could strike. But he could not. He was too weak. Now the problem was not that the main character didn't have the power, but that he needed to remember the basics and get back into shape. Only then would he be able to use his skills. Now, under this beautiful starry sky, Helmet made a promise to himself. To walk this path with dignity, to remember everything, to regain his lost form, and not to let Darien and Elga down. A new day had arrived, and with it, the beginning of the mission. The captain asked his subordinates not to relax, not to let down their guard, and for everyone to survive. Most of the boys were in a great mood, all except Pin, who had gotten into trouble again with his bylandish head by eating expired soup. For some reason, he thought that the protagonist had acted just as stupidly, but he still patted him on the back, saying that they should try to give it their all. But Helmet didn't need such instructions because he himself was going to show himself in the best light. The load was indeed enormous this time, and the Vanguard had to guard the rear chain. Accordingly, Tariq's detachment, which was clearly not in a friendly mood, was supposed to go ahead of the cargo. Unfriendly is an understatement, as threats of swift and brutal reprisals were immediately launched. This touched Pin to the quick. He even tried to snap back, but Helmet didn't care at all. Seeing this, the man continued to post other verbal insults, trying to irritate the main character, calling him a woman who can only hide behind others' backs, although it is unlikely that one can hide behind Pin's back. At that moment, the young man realized that there was no talk of any strained relationship. This was nothing less than a blood feud. In general, humans and demonic beasts have similarities. For example, they need to measure strength. Therefore, Helmet decided to keep a close eye on the blue-haired man until this task was completed. You never know what he could do. Unfortunately, He turned out to be right. The man bullied Pin every day. He would trip him up or insult him. The young man didn't have the moral strength to endure all this. He tried to snap back somehow, but it didn't make much difference to his offenders. On the contrary, they became increasingly aggressive, denying that they had done anything wrong. All this had a huge impact on Pina, but Helmet, unlike his comrade, was thicker-skinned and did not react to the offer of flowers. This behavior made the man very angry. He didn't understand how anyone could remain indifferent in such a situation because his fists were itching and he wanted a fight. His friend also noticed that the main character was behaving very provocatively and strangely, so it was difficult to predict what was on his mind. Only this way the main instigator believed that Helmet, being a fourth-rank mercenary, would not be able to do anything against him because he was essentially a third-rank mercenary, even though he was demoted to 4, so he could deal with such a weakling with one hand. Moreover, Helmet's behavior was the last straw for his patience, since the initial reason for his bad mood was that his brother had demoted him, so now he wanted to strangle the main character. Therefore, a cunning plan of revenge on the young man began to mature in his head. Meanwhile, Helmet and Pin were sitting next to their comrades, and the blonde was loudly indignant. But things did not go beyond empty words. Only a complete fool wouldn't have realized that something was wrong with Caleb after all. He was a third ranker, and they put him next to the newbies, but the guy had no proof. And without evidence, with only assumptions, no one will listen to him. Powerlessness and anger were choking Pina. He couldn't do anything, so in order to somehow drown out his emotions, he decided to go get some water. On the one hand, the main character understood his comrade's feelings, but he didn't want to interfere. He had enough problems of his own. This time the river was further from the camp than usual, and Pinu had to spend more time to get there. But he was happy that as soon as he finished with the water, he would be able to sleep soundly without thinking about anything. He was so deep in his thoughts that he didn't notice that unexpected guests had come to visit him. But even seeing the ripples on the blue surface of the river, he did not immediately understand what was happening and what he needed to do. Obviously, he needed to think faster, but that wasn't the case with Pin. He didn't have a plan for how to deal with Caleb and company. It was obvious that they hadn't come to drink some water and have a nice chat. The blonde's bottom felt like he was going to be beaten. The guy's premonition did not deceive him, and here he is lying on the ground with Caleb brazenly trampling on him with dirty boots, making ridiculous and dirty assumptions. Pain, resentment, anger, everything was mixed up in the guy's soul, which helped him not to close his eyes, snap back, and not allow himself to be broken. Caleb was only made more excited by this behavior, and he even invited Helmet to their mini-party. Obviously, all this was done to get a perverted pleasure from humiliating other people. Helmet understood this, but he came anyway. Sadly, the human world was no different from the root forest. Humans, just like demonic beasts, proved their status through strength. Now the protagonist understood his mentor. He clearly saw which people could not be trusted, and in general it was better not to have any dealings with them. Meanwhile, the men's bullying was about to reach a new level. They wanted to undress the main character and check whether he was a boy or a girl. But Helmet wasn't an ostrich, and he wasn't going to bury his head in the sand. Yes, his strength hadn't returned yet, and his body hadn't yet returned to its former form after training, but he was ready to defend his honor. People were weaker than Naho anyway. The plan came together instantly. First, he was going to defend himself and then deal with the weakest link among the attackers. And if the plan doesn't work, he'll use Darian's secret technique. The main thing is to stay calm and wait for the right moment, while the offenders have already pounced on the guy. But there was no clash, because Tanya intervened in the unequal battle and stopped Helmet, who was ready to fight back, and the attackers. Her voice was harder and sharper than steel, her words cold as ice as she asked why Tarek's mercenaries were harassing the Vanguard mercenaries. Caleb's excuse that they had gathered by the river for a nice chat seemed highly implausible, and the fact that they tried to undress Helmet is a common joke between men that a woman would not understand. But Tanya didn't believe this crazy nonsense, and asked Caleb to watch what he said and to whom, if he didn't want to become mute. It was better not to end the conversation there, so the girl ordered the main character to take Pin away. Moreover, Tanya decided to step on Caleb's sore spot at the end, reminding him that he used to be third rank, but now he has fallen to the very bottom and become fourth, so it is better to observe subordination. And if he still wants to regain his rank, then it is better for him to tone down his ardor, otherwise she will cease to be a peace-loving sweet girl. It was simply impossible not to understand her hint, so Caleb decided to retreat. Meanwhile, Pin was crying loudly, but the girl asked him to pull himself together and take buckets of water to the camp. Overall, Tanya was unhappy with the current situation, since none of her comrades had intervened in the conflict, and there was an unspoken rule not to do so when it came to fourth ranks. But today's situation went beyond all bounds. Night had fallen. It was as starry as many before, and only a lone silhouette moved smoothly and beautifully across the clearing, describing incredible figures with its blade. Helmet was not satisfied with situations where someone had to protect him. He wanted to become stronger and be able to protect both himself and those around him. After some time, he finished training and was very pleased with today's result. They had been on the road for about a week now, and every night when everyone went to bed, he went into the forest and trained hard. So in 7 days, he managed to get his body into shape. At this stage, the problem was different. The force was still sleeping soundly and was in no hurry to awaken. Yes, he remembered very well the words of the mentor about the warrior's body being a vessel for power, and until it is ready to receive it, then there is no point in even thinking about it. But he did not have time for long training. A new day had arrived, bringing new problems. Now the stretch of road began where there were many demonic beasts, so everyone had to walk in pairs if they didn't want to become someone's lunch. This did not please Helmet. Oh, how it did not please him. Because now he could no longer train at night, so he could only hope that the force would return before the seed of darkness took root in him. The protagonist was pulled out of his thoughts by Pin, who had recently been frightened by his senior colleagues with very creepy descriptions of demonic beasts. It was funny to hear all this because Helmet knew firsthand that demonic beasts come in different forms. Some are as scary as death, others are quite normal and adequate. This calmed Pin down and led him to the idea that a small piece of memory had returned to the main character. There was a mistake. The main character began to deny everything, realizing that he had to be more careful with what he said. While everything was fairly quiet, the mercenaries chatted pleasantly among themselves, making plans for where and how they would spend the money they received after completing the mission. They had already agreed to treat each other to dark beer and tasty snacks, when suddenly one of the mercenaries lost his head in front of the other. This turn of events knocked the ground out from under the man's feet. He didn't understand what had happened or what he should do. Meanwhile, a huge, scary monster was sending his comrade's head into its mouth. The monster appeared spectacularly and attracted the attention of all the mercenaries who were accompanying the cargo. Perhaps someone would have wanted to ignore it, but seeing how he was crunching the bodies of their comrades, they couldn't do it. Apparently, the initial reaction of fear and numbness had passed, after which many had an outburst of anger, so they attacked the monster. The young man wanted to avenge the death of his comrade, and did not hear how the others warned him that he could not attack the monster alone. This proved to be his fatal mistake, as the demonic beast killed him with one swing of its clawed paw. But these were already real problems, because none of the mercenaries noticed or felt the appearance of the monster. Now, what to do? No one had the slightest idea. Finn blamed himself for the fact that all this happened because of his fault, because he relaxed and did not keep an eye on his people. While the people didn't know what to do with the demonic beast, it continued to grab the mercenaries one by one, eating them, calling its lesser comrades to the feast. Tanya understood perfectly well that this monster was not alone here, which meant she needed to prepare for battle. The first line of defense was decided to be occupied by captains whose level was higher than everyone else. Helmet also realized that what he feared had actually happened. Tanya forbade Helmet and Pina from engaging in combat and asked them to hide under the carriage and interfere with the others. Pinu didn't need to be told twice. He pushed the protagonist in the direction of the carriage. The main character didn't really want to hide, but his strength hadn't returned yet, so he couldn't defeat the main monster yet. He could still feel through his skin that there were hundreds of other demonic beasts hiding in the forest, targeting them. This meant that his new acquaintances would most likely die, while Pin urged him on, as he was very scared and did not understand the protagonist's hesitation. So, after a few minutes, the guys found themselves under the carriage and watched everything that was happening around them. 3 captains stood against the main monster, which was weaker than Naho and Elga. Each of them was of the 2nd rank, which meant they could use the force which was necessary now. Unfortunately, now the main character could not help his comrades in any way. Then the demonic beast released its demonic energy, which pinned the mercenaries to their places. Nevertheless, the 3 captains rushed to the attack, because otherwise they would all die. The men immediately summoned their power. Their combined attack on the demonic beast was beautiful and effective. The rest cast admiring glances at their captains, who were doing great, despite the fact that they themselves had a lot of work to do. Meanwhile, the 3rd-rank mercenaries were doing an excellent job of dealing with the small monsters. This gave hope that everyone would be able to get out of this mess with minimal losses. The captains decided to combine their attacks again and finish off the huge demonic beast. The moment of truth has arrived. Here they will either kill the monster or they will have huge problems. While Finn attacked the monster from above, the other two captains targeted other vital points on its body. After receiving the wounds, the demonic beast roared loudly, and blood flowed from its wounds. While sending the small monster to the next world, Tanya was glad that her brother and two other captains had practically defeated the leader of the monsters. Helmet completely agreed with the girl, although he did not understand how this was possible, but people coped with the task better than he expected. The strategy of second-tier mercenaries holding back the strongest enemy while third-tier mercenaries finish off the rest was, in Helmet's opinion, very productive. And once again over the past few days, the protagonist mentally thanked Darien for all his instructions, because now he clearly saw what strategy was and realized why people should not be underestimated. Meanwhile, the largest demonic beast no longer looked as cheerful and confident as at the beginning of the fight. True, despite all the efforts of the captains, he was still alive and ready to resist them. The humans, although they looked no better than the demonic beast, also calculated the possibility of ending the battle with their victory. Since they all still had enough force reserves, they had one attempt to finish what they had started. But the monster had other plans. He decided to run away, since everyone wants to live. His speed was astounding. Just a second ago, he was in the clearing, and the next he was gone without a trace. The captains had never experienced anything like this in practice, despite the fact that they had plenty of this practice. Finn and the others had no intention of pursuing the demonic beast, since their main task was to escort it, and someone else would handle the cleanup. This was definitely the right decision. Now it was time to pull Helmet and Pin out from under the carriage, where they had been hiding the entire time of the battle. But the blonde man couldn't even crawl out from under the carriage calmly. His legs were numb, and he pitifully asked his comrades for help. Nobody wanted to waste their time on such trifles because they needed to check if all the monsters were dead, and then collect the seeds of darkness and skins. All of this could be sold and earn a decent amount of money. Who would have thought that you could make money on something like this? Certainly not Helmet, but the blonde man was already talking loudly about how the seeds of darkness drive people crazy and turn them into demonic beasts. But it's impossible to meet such individuals because they either die in the womb or are banished to the root forest after birth. In general, it's best to stay as far away from such people as possible because they can become real monsters at any moment. Of course, Helmet didn't want to admit it, but Darien was right in this matter too. Sooner or later, people like him would die at the hands of other people because there is nothing worse and stronger than fear. It is fear that pushes everyone to thoughtless cruelty. Moreover, he did not want to believe that one fine day he woke up early in the morning and saw in the mirror not his beautiful human face, but the terrible face of a demonic beast. This should not happen, for Darien taught him to use the Force not just for protection, but to suppress the seed of darkness within him. But now, his power was sleeping soundly, and it was unclear when it would decide to open its eyes, but even when it raised its eyelids, it would have to be hidden from other people, so that no one would understand that its source was the seed of darkness. Meanwhile, Finn watched Helmet and Pin, realizing that they reminded him very much of himself in those distant years when he was a greenhorn newbie. At that moment, Pin reached out his hands to one of the monsters, but the protagonist stopped him. Something was wrong with this demonic beast. Helmet's intuition didn't fail him, and a second later the monster came to life and squeezed the naive blonde's throat. But no one could count to 3 before Helmet drew his sword. And then one smooth movement, like the stroke of a pen, cut through the monster's body, thereby freeing Pin from the enemy's tenacious clutches. The blonde froze in horror. This was the first time something like this had happened to him, so the realization of his imminent death knocked the ground out from under his feet. Nevertheless, he looked at the drops of blood that flowed from Helmet's sword and tried to put on a mask of confidence, hiding it behind friendliness and concern. The protagonist wasn't particularly impressed, and it wasn't his first time killing monsters, but a strange feeling settled in his soul. Yes, it was a premonition, the same one that had saved his life more than once and warned him of danger. Now it was screaming about who his blows had changed. Something special had appeared in them. Perhaps it was the Force, or maybe something else. Meanwhile, Finn slowly approached the guys and praised Helmet, because if it weren't for his vigilance and reaction, Pin would have become the monster's dinner. Only Tanya didn't share in the general merriment. She stared intently at the main character, thinking that she was hallucinating and that it was time for her to go see a doctor herself. After all, the newbie definitely couldn't use the Force, or maybe he could. Whether the fleeting flash was real or just her imagination, the girl didn't know, and this was confusing. Time flew by rather quickly. A quiet night embraced the travelers, and only one person hid from everyone under its cover and meditated. Although it was dangerous to remain alone in the forest, he needed a few minutes of solitude to confirm or refute his guesses and premonitions. Now he could breathe a sigh of relief, because the force had returned, which meant he could suppress the seed of darkness within himself. This was great news. I'll have to thank Pin somehow, because if it weren't for his carelessness and stupidity, the awakening of the force would have been delayed. And now I could relax a little. But spending more time alone is unlikely to work out, so it will only take a few days to return her to her previous level. And as proof, the silence of the night forest was pierced by Pin's cry, who decided that Helmet was lost and needed to be found urgently. We had to return to the camp, where Finn was already conducting the briefing. The entire squad was divided into 3 groups of 2 people. They would have to take turns after a while, maintain the fire and order, and most importantly, not sleep on duty, as the forest was teeming with monsters. Finn didn't even understand how right he was, because the monster that had escaped from them in the morning was not far from the camp and was watching them, waiting for the right moment to attack. Helmet could feel it on his skin, because the force had sharpened all his innate instincts. His shift was ending, and Tanya asked to wake up their replacement so that the guy could sleep, because tomorrow would be a difficult day. But the main character had no intention of sleeping. Under the watchful gaze of the full moon, he wanted to survey the area and restore his strength by killing the silent monsters. But he wasn't the only one with plans for the rest of the night. Caleb also didn't sleep, and seeing his sworn enemy going into the forest, he decided to follow him, with clearly bad intentions. Did this matter to Helmet? Obviously not, because at this rate he could quickly restore his previous level of strength by tomorrow, and everything else was secondary for now. But he also couldn't ignore the enemy's approach, even though he understood that it wasn't a demonic beast approaching him, but a man. Caleb, as always, was in his element. Under his feigned friendliness, he hid his attempts to humiliate the young man. But the main character didn't want to contact him, so he asked him to leave him alone and go about his important business. But the man didn't understand the young man's hidden warning, so he began to claim that the hour of reckoning had come, and Tanya would no longer help him. He kept talking, and didn't want to stop, but his fists were itching to teach a lesson to the impudent and arrogant newcomer who dared to ignore his wickedness. Moreover, his plans included breaking the main character's arm and leg, or better yet, both at once. And if a guy dies during training, it won't be a great loss. There's no place for weaklings among mercenaries. But not a single word, not a single threat impressed Helmet. He understood perfectly well that this man could not do anything to him now. Moreover, the man behaved not like a human, but like a demonic beast, which means he should be treated as a demonic beast. But if Caleb considers himself a human being, then he must behave like a human being, with dignity. True, dignity and honor were words for the man whose meaning he did not know, so he laughed mockingly. For him, only strength mattered. It was what determined the status of mercenaries, and besides, he had long since recovered and was ready to show who was who here. Caleb was confident that he could crush the protagonist's skull with one blow. Only his wishes and dreams remained just wishes and dreams, as Helmet intercepted his hand, squeezed it, almost breaking it, not allowing him to hit him. This was unexpected, because the main character looked weak. So where did he get such enormous strength from? Helmet was disappointed, because the man's sense of smell was much worse than that of the demonic beast with which he had previously compared him. And if a man justified all his actions by force, then he should see their difference in strength, and know his place, which is on his knees before him. But even with such an obvious hint, Caleb could not believe what was happening, nor accept that Helmet was a head or two taller than him. No matter how many blows he tried to inflict on the main character, not a single one reached the target, and Helmet did not even draw his sword from its sheath to block them. Soon the protagonist got tired of all this, so he summoned Slew, which shocked the enemy. Everything happened so quickly after that, Caleb didn't even notice when Helmet cut his femoral arteries. The man could no longer fight. He fell to the ground and writhed in pain, cursing the day that life brought him together with this child. The main character was worried that he couldn't contain the force. He wasn't yet used to using it. At that moment, he noticed that the man was trying to crawl away, which could have caused his exposure. Suddenly, the boy heard the seed of darkness calling to him, persuading him to kill this man because he was dangerous, because he needed to keep the secret, and no one would shed tears over it. It sounded so right, I wanted to give in to this call and not think about anything else. Just take and kill. Get rid of the danger. But Helmet found the strength within himself and, with the help of the Force, suppressed the seed of darkness within himself. Even if it was for a short moment, the main character felt like a demonic beast, and it scared him a little. It was too difficult to control himself, but he was able to come to his senses by remembering that he was Helmet and not a demonic beast. But while he was coming to his senses, his opponent was able to crawl into the thicket of the forest, believing that this would help him. Meanwhile, Caleb crawled forward, crying from unbearable pain, losing a lot of blood, not understanding how Helmet could use the Force, because he looked weaker than that demonic beast. But the man was not destined to escape, because the demonic beast that was pursuing them had other plans. Helmet noted phlegmatically that Caleb had become the demonic beast's dinner. The monster had the same plans for the main character, but the guy was ready for everything. By and large, the demonic beast now owes him, since it took his prey for itself. Overall, the situation had changed a lot. Last time Helmet couldn't do anything, but now the power had returned, and he could kill the monster. It was stupid to drag things out. It was time to move on to the main course, which apparently the demonic beast didn't want, so he backed away, acknowledging the protagonist's strength. But this demonic beast was not as simple as it wanted to seem. It could read the strength and aura of its opponents. If so, then it was possible to come to an agreement. So Helmet suggested that the demonic beast take Caleb and disappear into the fog. Otherwise, he would turn into a corpse. The monster didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed the man's corpse and ran away. The guy was able to get rid of at least one problem, but the beast will still return, and you need to be prepared for this. Now, everything that had happened had to be somehow explained to the other mercenaries and done convincingly. For a long time, no one in the camp could believe that such a strong mercenary as Caleb could die so easily. The point was that a man was chasing him in the forest to beat him up, but a demonic beast appeared out of nowhere and killed the man. The captain of Tarek's squad asked the protagonist for forgiveness for the behavior of one of his squad members, because of him, he almost died. Helmet stood and remained silent. He was ready to agree with everything, as long as he wasn't asked uncomfortable questions, but Tanya lost her temper. Verbal apologies weren't enough for her. After all, the elders knew what Caleb was doing and always turned a blind eye to everything, encouraging the disgusting behavior of the deceased. The girl shouldn't have allowed herself to make such an attack. After all, she was insulting the deceased younger brother of the squad's vice-captain Tarek, who was deeply grieving the loss. But the girl stood her ground, claiming that if everyone had noticed Caleb's bad behavior earlier, talked to him, and set him on the right path, then none of this would have happened. The conflict flared up like dry reeds, because in essence the girl had insulted not only Caleb but also Tarek's entire squad. It is unknown how this skirmish would have ended if Miles had not intervened. He was the only one who thought clearly so far. They had more important problems than the feud between the two squads. It was impossible to help the dead, so it was necessary to think about the living, and therefore the employer was ready to pay Helmet compensation for the stress he had experienced. Only now did Tanya realize that she had gone a bit too far, and asked her colleague for forgiveness. Miles was not a stupid man. He understood that this was a temporary measure, so to speak, the calm before the storm. So the issue of security and movement had to be resolved quickly. It was necessary to be extremely careful now, because there were 3 people less, but there were no fewer monsters. When the Vanguard squad was left alone, Helmet received a reprimand from Tanya, because he had no right to walk alone in the forest and put his life in danger. But he wasn't just there for no reason. He wanted to quickly solve the problem with the main monster and continue training in peace, but he couldn't tell the girl that. After a few minutes, Tanya cooled down. She did not absolve herself of responsibility, realizing that she should have kept a better eye on the newcomers. And at that moment, when she asked the guy not to go anywhere without friends, cold, but at the same time warming feelings stirred in his memory and soul, so strongly reminiscent of Darien. The girl couldn't stay angry with such a handsome man as the main character for long, so she asked him to be careful in the future. A new day had dawned. The detachment set out on its journey. They had to be on guard, monitor the situation. Any more losses were unacceptable. This section of the road was much more difficult than the previous ones. Moreover, at every turn there were monster ambushes waiting for them. At this pace, they could not hold out for more than a couple of days, because as soon as they got tired, huge problems began. These rascals attacked from the rear, but what was more important was that their leader was also pursuing them, watching, waiting, sending small fry to wear out the mercenaries. It was impossible not to call the creature unreasonable. He had calculated everything and was preparing for something extremely important. Another difficult day came to an end, and it was time to rest a little. Everyone already had many injuries and there was practically no strength left. Tanya and Finn watched the boys, realizing that many of their people were no longer in the best shape, and the monster attacks were becoming longer and more violent. It was good that everyone was alive for now, but the question was how long this would last, whether they would be able to complete the mission without losses. They had Pin and Helmet in reserve. The first could dodge well, but the second was a good swordsman. But that wasn't so important, because the most interesting thing was that the monsters only attacked the vanguard and didn't touch Tarek's group. It was stranger than snow falling on a hot summer night. Yes, and Tarek's group won't help them willingly, even if they ask, so the vanguard needs to survive this mission on their own. That night, Miles called Paul to talk to him. He clearly saw that the monsters were attacking only the rear of the caravan, which suggested that the leader of the monsters was up to something. At this rate, the vanguard will run out of power and will fall, so it would be logical to join forces for the sake of common safety. This might have been a good idea, but not for Tariq's squad, so Paul suggested acting efficiently rather than humanely. The mercenaries' proposal was that the vanguard squad would distract the enemies, while Tarek's squad would leave the forest, and the important cargo would remain safe. Miles, of course, understood that his interlocutor was not the most decent person, but he did not expect such meanness from him. But high ideals were not for Paul, because conscience and honor only sounded nice. But in reality, everything was much more prosaic. And if we take a strict approach to the situation they found themselves in, it was more important for everyone to survive, no matter by what means. Now they were under direct threat of death at the hands of demonic beasts, and they had practically no strength to resist. Moreover, if they lost a good portion of the mercenaries in battle, which was quite likely, then the man's investment would hardly pay off, given all the compensation and losses. But if there were other ways to solve the problem, then he was willing to use them, and his option was quite relevant. It's time for Miles to decide what he wants. To be good to everyone, or just to survive, even if it means sacrificing others. A new day dawned, and the squad set out on their journey. Unfortunately, due to constant attacks, Tanya and the other members of her group became very tired. It was obvious that people, even horses, were already at the limit of their capabilities, and how many monsters remained in this forest was unknown. Tarek's mercenaries had no intention of helping them, and in the morning they simply stood and watched as the vanguard members fought, which looked quite strange. Finn himself understood that at this rate this task would not end well, but he could not do anything. At that moment, he noticed that Tarek's mercenaries had suddenly accelerated, leaving them behind. From the outside, it became clear that this was some sort of escape, and no one was going to stop, no matter how much Tanya and the other members of the vanguard shouted after them. The calculation was obvious. Since the monsters only attacked the vanguard squad, Tarek's squad decided to flee, leaving their colleagues to be torn apart by the monsters. If this were a Turkish series, a dramatic minor melody would have played at this point, because Finn and his guys were cruelly betrayed. Meanwhile, Helmet assessed the current situation. No matter how hard they tried, they wouldn't be able to catch up with Tarek's squad. And besides, the demonic beasts had surrounded them. The battle was inevitable. The question was, how many people would die in this battle and how many would survive? Meanwhile, Fina ordered his men to gather and fight, because there was nowhere to run, there was no help to wait for, and they could only rely on their own strength. The countdown began, and within minutes a horde of monsters pounced on the vanguard fighters. The mercenaries fought with all their strength. Most of them were seriously wounded, and it was extremely difficult for them to hold back the influx of monsters. Some of them were ready to accept a dignified death and practically resigned themselves to it, because surviving in such a situation was extremely difficult. Meanwhile, the protagonist was tormented by a dilemma. On the one hand, he understood that if he interfered in the battle, these people would survive, but they would ask a lot of questions: who he was, where he came from, why he was so strong, and whether he was even human. But at the same time, this no longer mattered. Because today, more than anything in the world, the young man wanted to save these people who not long ago extended a helping hand to him. No questions asked. He remembered all the instructions of his teacher, but today he would trust people for the first and last time, and it would be right. And then something happened that no one expected to see. The protagonist called upon his power and asked the members of the vanguard to remember everything they were about to see, because it was a terrible secret. And then, with precise movements, he began to destroy the small monsters one after another. Their lifeless bodies fell to the ground, covering it with black clots of dark energy. Helmet pinned the last small monster to the ground with his sword, putting a bold end to this difficult battle. For the first time in a long time, the young man felt complete satisfaction both from having stretched his muscles and from having saved his comrades. The last monster was dead, and the young man put away his sword. The vanguard mercenaries stood frozen in mute amazement, because they thought that Helmet was just an ordinary newcomer, and here was such a sharp turn of events. For now, the protagonist didn't pay any attention to the mercenaries because he was thinking that the demonic beasts had scattered after the death of their comrades, but it was unknown whether they would return or not. The first to break the frightening silence was Pin, who asked who the main character really was. Helmu had no intention of revealing the secrets of his identity, saying that nothing special had happened. He had simply regained his strength. But Tanya was mentally praising all the gods because she already thought that she was not quite right in the head. But look how it turned out. Helmet actually possessed the Force. But until that moment, none of the mercenaries knew that someone at such an early age could possess the Force, so there were more questions than answers. And this despite the fact that they had recently caught a young man half dead in the river. Phil was also shocked because he was a second-rank mercenary, but even he was not capable of such a level of mastery of the Force. Therefore, everyone had a logical question. Who and where could have taught the main character to use the Force? But here the guy paused for a long time, because although he had decided to trust these people, he decided to keep silent about the root forest, saying that he had lived in the forest for a long time, without specifying which one, where he met his teacher. He could not remember anything else. Amnesia was the right move, because absolutely everything could be blamed on it, and no one would have any more questions. With the vanguard now safe from harm, Helmet was curious about what Finn was planning to do next, but this was the right question, which immediately turned on the man's thought process, and he came to the conclusion that the first thing they needed to do was get out of the trap, after which find the squad that abandoned them and, if possible, take revenge on them. Helmet didn't know what he would do after the mission, but until it was completed, he would be with the vanguard since he hadn't yet received his money for completing the job. This answer suited Fina just fine, so he suggested that everyone go ahead and find Tarek's squad. Although they had already been on the road for a whole day, they still hadn't caught up with their colleagues' detachment. Although there was one big plus in the whole situation. They were well rested, were in no hurry, and many of their wounds had already healed. It was just strange that they hadn't met anyone, even though there were a lot of tracks. It seemed like Tarek's squad had been on the road all night, which meant they could have already left the forest. According to the route plan, they should stop in a nearby village where they will find them. All members of the vanguard squad were already in anticipation. They couldn't wait to see the faces of their colleagues when they learned that they had all survived. Pin agreed with this, but he didn't understand for what kind of merits they would be given money, and whether they would be given money at all. And on that note, everyone looked at him unanimously, because indeed the old man had taken the entire load, and they basically had nothing to pay for. But Helmut was worried about something completely different. He heard an incomprehensible, but very loud noise, and something sucked unpleasantly in the pit of his stomach. No one could understand what was happening to the young man, because by and large everything was as usual. None of them could sense the demonic energy that the protagonist clearly saw and felt. His sixth sense told him that in the distance a fierce battle was taking place between Tarek's squad and the main monster and his small charges. At the current speed, the vanguard was about an hour away from the scene of action, and besides, the leader was there. The young man understood that they had to hurry, because those people wouldn't last long. Although on the other hand, he didn't force anyone to follow him. The choice was up to the vanguard, and Finn decided to act honorably, because they were mercenaries, not avengers. So for them, the main goal was to complete the mission well, and personal grievances should remain personal. First, it was necessary to sort out all the matters, and then it would be possible to teach Tarek's squad a little lesson. So they resolutely moved forward to help their colleagues, to prove to everyone that being a mercenary sounds proud. Meanwhile, Tarek's squad was surrounded by monsters. They fought back with all their might, but luck was clearly not on their side. Even force wielders like Paul were exhausted, even though it had only been a day since they had escaped the vanguard. And there was no end to the monsters. He didn't expect that the monsters would start pursuing them so closely, since their initial target was the vanguard fighters. The man didn't know what had changed radically, but he assumed that there weren't enough vanguard fighters to deal with the monsters, so they took them on. Moreover, at the head of the small monsters was their leader, who was not to be trifled with. It was obvious that it was necessary to escape from the battlefield by any means necessary, since the force reserves were no longer sufficient. Paul understood perfectly well that at this rate they would soon be finished, because they could still cope with the small monsters. But going up against the leader was like death for them. The vanguard was most likely destroyed, so if they fled the battlefield now, there simply would be no witnesses to their shame. And just a few minutes later, Max and Paul left their people to be torn apart by the monsters and ran away. At that moment, Miles, looking out the window, realized that he had made a fatal mistake when he followed Paul's lead the day before, and now he was in danger of death. Too late, he realized that he couldn't trust Tarek's mercenaries, but what's done is done. His heart told him that it could all end in something like this, because the boomerang always comes back. And their boomerang was the leader of the monsters, who really wanted to feast on a human being. The realization of doom hit him like a swelling on the head, and a clawed paw grabbed one of the crew members. The monster was already anticipating a delicious lunch when he suddenly realized that something was going wrong. And he was right, because he again had to deal with the main character, who had no intention of looking at such a feast. Helminth did not waste time on empty talk and attacked his opponent. But the first blow did not cause much harm to the monster. He blocked it successfully and now jumped back. The demonic beast, until it dawned on him that the protagonist was not joking, insistently demanded that the man be released. But after a couple of minutes, the meaning of the protagonist's words reached the monster, so he threw the kidnapped man away from himself. Helmet had no trouble catching one of his employers, but that was only the beginning. He had to decide what to do with the monster. The guy remembered Finn's words, who an hour ago had asked him to go forward first, since the man had a bad feeling. After all, Talik's detachment could hold out. But it was unlikely that they would care much about the lives of their employers. Their own shirt was closer to the body. It only meant that they would most likely abandon Miles and run away, a premonition. But I did not let the man down. Now the protagonist understood that if he had been even a couple of minutes late, there would have been no living people left here. Most of them would have become food for the monsters. Now everything was much simpler than a couple of minutes before. The strength had returned to the main character, and the monster stood in his way, so his further actions were obvious. Helmet was going to fight with all his might, as he did in the root forest. But his opponent was unlucky. He rushed towards his opponent in a purple whirlwind, forcing him to go into deep defense. The small monsters decided to help their predecessor, but they were in for a huge disappointment when they were killed by the main character. They were too weak for the guy, so they had no chance of stopping him. This was a sure defeat for the leader. No matter how menacingly he roared, no matter how many of his assistants he called, he could not stop the purple whirlwind. However, the protagonist understood that in front of him stood the strongest demonic beast he had ever encountered outside the root forest. And yet he still had enough strength to kill the monster. He just needed to stay alert, concentrate, and deliver a clear, penetrating blow. To begin with, the young man decided to cut off the monster's claws so that it could not scratch or tear him. Before the monster came to its senses, it was necessary to quickly strike it again directly in the head. But the monster managed to block the protagonist's sword. Unbearable pain tore through the demonic beast's entire being. Its paws were bleeding, and a despairing roar pierced the thicket of the forest. Only unexpectedly, the main character noticed that the monster's demonic energy had strengthened. But how this had happened was unclear. It seems like he's absorbing all the demonic energy around him, so he's become much stronger than he was a couple of minutes ago. The only good news was that the vanguard mercenaries were supposed to arrive soon, but whether they would help him deal with the monster was the question. On the other hand, they could get hurt if they tried to help the guy, so he had to finish what he started himself. Only now, having absorbed a huge amount of demonic energy, the main monster attacked the young man, and he did it quickly. But the guy wasn't a pushover, so he easily avoided direct attacks. It was obvious that he couldn't cope if he used the force as usual, so it was time for extreme measures. First, it was necessary to put maximum strength into the blows, and then come what may. And the demonic beast planned to put all the accumulated demonic energy into the next series of strikes. The demonic beast definitely became faster, and dodging it became much more difficult. The claws have also grown. The longer the fight goes on, the more problematic it becomes. At some point, the protagonist noticed that he had failed to dodge the monster's latest attack, so it managed to rip his shirt with its overgrown claws. It was quite problematic, and he would have to spend money to buy a new one. Meanwhile, the demonic beast had accumulated even more demonic energy. It was obvious that the monster had absorbed the energy of the other beasts. But even realizing this, the young man remained absolutely calm. The moment the demonic beast leapt upwards, winged with power, Helmet realized that he had seen something like this before. This type of attack definitely reminded the protagonist of an old acquaintance, so he calmed down. In all its movements, in all its strategic decisions, this demonic beast reminded the young man of the serpent, but it was not several times weaker than Naho. This meant that the main character could defeat him, so he gathered his courage, put all his power into the sword, and attacked the enemy. While the main character was fighting the monster, the vanguard squad rushed to his aid at full speed. Only when they ran into the clearing did they not expect to see Helmet, completely safe and sound, standing next to the corpse of a huge monster. Finn expected to see a lot, but not this, so he was more than shocked, not believing his eyes. It was obvious that the mercenaries from Tarek's squad were defeated and began to scatter, unable to cope with the onslaught of the monsters, because apart from the employer and the young man, no one else was visible here. It was bitter to realize that there were still captains who betrayed their own people. They clearly had neither honor nor dignity. The overall picture was quite horrific. Many killed monsters, many killed mercenaries, but Miles was alive. So Finn ordered to look for more survivors, and then set out. The old man took quite a while to come to his senses, and at one point it even seemed to him that he had gone to heaven, as he clearly heard the voice of the vanguard captain. But he survived, and was on Earth. Moreover, he needed to answer for his actions. So the man began to plaintively ask Finn for forgiveness for his betrayal. True, the old man still did not understand that he had survived, that these were not hallucinations, that this was not a figment of his sick imagination, and that these were not angels in front of him, but living people. So there was a silent pause. Realization came to Miles gradually, raising the question of what had happened to the monsters, because there were too many of them. It was hard to believe that all the monsters were dead, but it was true. The only thing Finn couldn't tell was that Helmut had killed them all. But this was all lyricism, and it's time to move on to prose, namely, not to prayers, but to a reward. The new contract didn't bode well for Miles, as he was required to give 80% of the proceeds to the Vanguard mercenaries, and that was only because he had suffered, and if that hadn't happened, he would have paid 100% as compensation for betrayal. The man tried to negotiate more favorable terms for himself, because he also needed to somehow miraculously try to compensate for his losses. But this was his personal problem, not the mercenaries, and if he didn't want to sign this contract, then he had to get to his destination on his own. But this filled Miles with awe. He understood that he would not survive in this forest without the help of mercenaries. It was only for this reason that he signed the contract without complaint, even though he understood that he would be left with nothing, but life was more important. The contract was signed, and now it was time to find out what this important commodity was and where they were transporting it, with their own lives. The man didn't want to reveal his secrets because, if rumors started to spread, the entire association would be at risk, and the Vanguard mercenaries could suffer. This angered Finn. He couldn't understand why the man hadn't warned him in advance that this mission was so important and so secret. The man had nowhere to go, so he had to tell everything. It turned out that this time Miles was fulfilling an order for a client who called himself the magician Antiol. This was already an unexpected turn of events because the person in question was a real archimandrite. But another question arose. Why was such an important person asking the Merchant Association to transport cargo through the lands of demonic beasts? Shouldn't the official authorities know about this product? This was a correct guess because they were transporting goods from places where magicians were forbidden to enter. Specifically, the conversation was about the Temple of Lumen, so perhaps it would have been better for the Vanguard fighters not to ask questions. He left for the train. It is known that the power of the Holy Church is beyond imagination. It was they who defeated the Demon King 1,000 years ago. Over the years, the members of the Holy Church began to gain strength and power, but their intentions were not as pure as they had been originally. Now they are using their name to take over the entire world. Most of the kingdoms are already under their complete control. But magic is beyond their power, so they always keep a close eye on magicians. And if they find out that the Bhutan Association is delivering temple goods for study to a magician with whom they have a long-standing conflict, then it is obvious what will happen next. Finn understood perfectly well that in such a situation the Holy Church would destroy the association. But it's not just the association that will get the brunt of this. Absolutely everyone involved in this task will get what they deserve. So powerful is the church, and it has long been unjust. Miles admitted that he himself did not want to agree to this, but once Antiol saved the head of the association, so they could not refuse. The only one who didn't understand what was being discussed was Helmut, who didn't believe that some archmage could be so famous. This was indeed true, since Antiol was the one who almost destroyed the divine barrier several years ago. But this already interested the young man, because he knew firsthand what the divine barrier was. Today, protection against demonic beasts is installed around large cities. The point is that the barrier also detects mages, which is why the church tries to catch them. Moreover, the divine barrier was too strong, and no one in history had ever been able to break through it. Although for magicians who craved freedom, it was a matter of honor. One day, Antiol almost destroyed the city barrier, but the church hushed it up. This story made the young man think because the church could not get rid of the seed of darkness that was in him, so they exiled him after the birth of the root forest. But the archmage can influence the divine barrier, which means there is a chance that he can extract the seven darknesses from it and destroy it without harming the main character. Overall, the dark mage from the root forest was useless, so now Helmet decided to test how useful the light archmage would be. Towards evening, the vanguard detachment emerged from the forest and found itself on safe lands. They decided to spend the night here too. Meanwhile, Finn really wanted to talk to Helmet, and they had a lot to discuss. When they moved away from the rest of the guys, the captain handed the guy a seed, which warriors eat when their strength and endurance run out. The man didn't know whether Helmet would need this seed or not, but nevertheless, he gave it to him. The guy, without thinking twice, swallowed it and felt how his body began to glow and fill with energy. It was nice and definitely helped restore his lost strength. But the guy didn't understand why the captain gave him such a valuable item. It was simple. It was gratitude. After all, it was Helmet who fearlessly and single-handedly defended the Vanguard squad from the most evil monster. It is obvious that if it were not for the efforts of the protagonist, the mercenaries and Miles would have died in the forest. Besides, this seed, compared to the lives of the captain, Miles, and the other mercenaries, was a mere trifle. And when the young man leaves their squad, goes his own way trying to restore his memory, no matter what happens to him, no matter what trouble he gets into, Helmet can boldly call them for help. The Vanguard does not abandon its own. At this moment, the main character first realized the meaning of the word comrade and extended his hand to Finn to shake it. The man willingly shook the young man's hand, acknowledging that from now on and forever they were brothers in spirit. A new day dawned, and the Vanguard detachment moved forward, leaving the transit point. The road was very busy, so when Miles saw the landmark tree through the carriage window, he was incredibly happy that they had reached their destination. Finn checked the map, and indeed they had arrived at the right place, but it wasn't even a village, just some clearing. So he didn't understand why the goods had to be delivered here. But that wasn't the end. They had to hand over the goods to the Archmage. They just left them in the clearing. Finn had a lot of questions, but Miles was in no hurry to answer them, because it was better to see everything with your own eyes once than to listen to a boring explanation 100 times. And then magic began to happen, as the merchant activated a magical amulet next to the landmark tree, and a blue whirlwind of magical glow filled the entire clearing. Helmet and the other mercenaries saw real magic happen in real time, and it took their breath away. After which they began to move through time and space to the designated place where the Archmage was supposed to be waiting for them. Finn had heard a lot about something similar, but he couldn't even imagine that it would happen to him. Only Helmet doubted that it was real magic, because it could have just been an illusion. But the man next to him noted that it had become sharply colder, and his body was reacting to the changed reality, which meant that they had moved quite a large distance. But the most interesting thing is that when the transfer ended, they saw a huge tower in front of them, in front of which a man stood and waited for them. This man was the Archmage, who was already tired of waiting for guests in his abode. It was an elderly wizard who welcomed the representatives of the Bhutanese trade into his home because they had brought them something very important. He checked the contents of the carts and found that everything was in place, although some items must have been difficult to find, but since they were in place, an excellent job had been done, and he was more than satisfied with everything. Only then did he notice that there were fewer mercenaries than he expected, and he could feel the energy of lost human life. So he concluded that some of the mercenaries had died. Unfortunately, they encountered a very large demonic beast along the way. So many died, and only a third of the team made it here. The Archmage understood that the road was indeed difficult, and the mercenaries, like the merchant, had had to endure a lot, and he felt that dark energy was coming from the cart. Could it be that they had brought a monster? Only it wasn't a living monster, but a dead one, ready for sale. So if the man wanted to buy it, Miles would gladly sell it. Oh, it was a tempting offer. So Antiol decided to buy this carcass and add its cost to the main amount, so he was ready to pay 150,000 marks. For the mercenaries, the announced amount seemed unrealistic. Of course, they had heard that archmages were incredibly rich, but they didn't think they were that rich. So it was time to go into the house, so Miles ordered the men to take the goods and leave the cart here, since there was no longer any need for it. At that moment, Helmet assessed the man in front of him, realizing that he was quite strong, and his strength was different from Arago's, not only because he could completely hide it there, but there was something else. At that moment, the man turned his gaze to the main character as if he sensed something interesting. Sometimes magicians can see what others cannot see. Especially specialists of his level can look deeper and see what is hidden deep down. At this point, Helmet decided to end the conversation that had just begun, since the others shouldn't know some things. The main character definitely seemed like a rather daring guy to the wizard, and there was something he wanted to keep a secret. But it was not to be. The man knew 1,000 secrets of this world and always treated them with respect. That's why he put up a barrier now, so the main character didn't have to worry about anyone finding out his secret. That would never happen. The man's body was wrapped in chains. This was the so-called Oath of the Magician. If the man breaks the promise he just made, he will lose a huge part of his powers. This oath is not available to ordinary people. Now he was ready to listen to Helmet, and most importantly, to get an answer to the question of what he needed. The protagonist understood that this man did not look like the magician from the forest, in which case he could ask him something, and perhaps ask for help. The archmage expected something like this, so he asked the boy directly if he wanted to receive information about what was deep inside him, namely, about the seed of darkness. Certainly, such ingenuity was surprising, and the protagonist wanted to know if there was a way to remove it from his body. There is only one answer to this question, namely, it is simply impossible to remove the 7 darknesses from the human body. The seed of darkness is directly related to human life. The core with demonic energy would not be born in a baby who is destined to die in the womb. It allows a person to remain alive, so that until death, a person and the seed of darkness are one. And if someone gets rid of him, it's not hard to guess what will happen to him. The person will die immediately. But the protagonist's hope of getting rid of the hated seed of darkness had not yet faded. He believed that a person like the archmage could find a way to free him from this punishment. But magicians are not gods. And besides, this is the first time a man has encountered the fact that a person is generally capable of controlling the seed of darkness. The fact is that the seed requires demonic energy from its carrier. But if a person rejects dark magic, he provokes darkness, forcing it to devour him from the inside. A person cannot resist such an influence for long, and over time he goes mad, after which he absorbs demonic energy and turns into a demonic beast. But the protagonist's case was unique, as he could suppress the seed of darkness using light magic or the force. Both require a lot of time to master, but those seeds that do not have magic attack the mind much faster. Perhaps the guy was not exposed to demonic energy enough to awaken the seed, and while the temple hasn't discovered him, the archmage will be interested in meeting him again. And there, the young man was curious whether this man knew that he came from the root forest. The good news was that the priests of Lumen would not be able to detect the seed of darkness inside the boy. They would have to study his body for that. Even with the archmage's abilities and his many years of experience, he was only able to notice the seed because it reacted to the demonic energy present nearby. Under any other circumstances, this would have been impossible. This gave the guy the idea that he needed to avoid places where there was demonic energy and magicians in order to keep his secret a secret. Besides, it is unlikely that Helmet will have a pleasant and easy future. Over time, his strength will grow, and perhaps he will become a great man if he manages to avoid the influence of the temple's followers. However, given that every single one of those who carried the seed of darkness under their hearts became criminals or monsters, it will ultimately break the main character as well. In this way, the guy will destroy this world and destroy many people with his own hands. This is the fate that is destined for all carriers of the seed of darkness. No one has yet managed to change it. But the main character was determined. He didn't like all these high-flown words because he was a man, which meant that none of the above would happen. Suddenly, the archmage admitted that he hadn't encountered anything that could interest him so much in a long time. So he would be keeping a close eye on the main character. But if the guy can't cope with his internal struggle, then the man will have to stop him in order to save this world. But who knows, perhaps Helmet is destined to surpass the archmage and even subjugate the darkness itself. At this point, the strange conversation between the protagonist and the archmage behind the barrier ended, after which Finn took the guy aside and handed him the money he had earned through honest labor. The man admitted that he would have liked to give the guy a little more money, but the rest of the team also contributed to the task, so they also deserved a reward. That wasn't all. Finn handed Helmet a bag with his things, since it didn't belong to any of the squad members, which meant the guy was the owner. At this moment, the main character remembered that it was with him that he left the root forest, but thought that he had lost it during his adventure. True, If it weren't for all the fuss with the monsters, Finn would have given the main character this bag much earlier, but simply because of the tension and stress, he forgot about it, and only now remembered. Besides, it was the Vanguard squad that should be thanking the guy since he was, by and large, their savior, so Finn wished him a good journey. At that moment, Pin ran up to them. He was happy that the mission was finally over, and he would be able to take his new acquaintance to their headquarters and show him many interesting things that were there. The only problem was that Helmet had no intention of going to the mercenary headquarters. He had other plans. To tell the truth, this news broke the blonde boy's heart, because he had found a friend, and now he had to lose him. But unlike Pin, Tanya understood that the main character had his own reasons for acting this way, and forcing him to change his decision was wrong. However, she advised Helmet to keep his mercenary certificate, as the third rank was the maximum for a temporary certificate. So that was all they could give him. However, this was enough for the guy. At that moment, the girl clearly realized that their new acquaintance had important things to do, and they were much more important than the lost memories. She also asked the protagonist to be careful and take care of himself. For the second time in his life, Helmet met good people who helped him understand the meaning of the word comrade, so he was going to sort out his problems and meet them at least once more. Everyone wished him a happy day and a smooth road. Pin even cried, because in such a short period of time he had become attached to the main character. To somehow console the blonde guy, the main character said that the food the guy cooked was very tasty. But this did not calm Pina down, but made him cry even more, but now from happiness. Even though he understood that no one had died, Finn reminded Helmet that if he needed help, the boy would have to find Vanguard, and he, as captain, would keep the promise he had recently made. This was enough for the young man, and he decided to end his farewell on this note, because the road called him forward. At that moment he felt a slight stabbing pain in his chest, the same as when his mentor died and when he left Elga. But if he stays with the mercenaries, he will encounter demonic energy, and then the seed of darkness within him will absorb it. And when he goes, this should not have happened. He did not want to become a slave to the inner darkness. He wanted to prevent the future that the Archmage described to him. Unfortunately, he didn't know whether he would be able to do it or not, but it was worth a try. To test everything, it was necessary to become stronger, and for this it was necessary to find a mentor. Meanwhile, in the tavern, the escaped captains of Tarek's squad were reflecting on the fact that they should not have taken on this task, because they almost died, and one of them lost his younger brother. The past can't be brought back, but since they survived, they could help Tarek's mercenaries recover. They needed to think positively, pull themselves together, and start over. What happened to Caleb was terrible, of course, but the others were worthless. And to prevent something like this from happening again, it was necessary to find talented young people. But suddenly, they looked out the window and saw the healthy-looking mercenaries of the Vanguard squad, without a hint of pallor. Paul and Max had only one question. How did these guys manage to get out of that damned forest? Suddenly, Pin felt someone's gaze on him and turned towards the tavern, but there was no one at the table anymore. It's no surprise, since Paul and Max hid under the table, realizing that they had suffered a crushing failure during the last mission in every respect. It would be better if they lay low for a while. Maybe that monster had a weak spot that they didn't know about, which is why the Vanguard survived. But in that case, they now had to be killed. After all, sooner or later, the other guilds will find out about the disgrace. It's only a matter of time. Of course, Max didn't think that he would have to end his career in such a way. However, Paul had a brilliant idea, and since they were still second-tier mercenaries, he ordered Max to follow him. Overall, the situation was at a standstill, and if they didn't want to die of hunger, they would have to resort to criminal activity, namely stealing. Meanwhile, in one of the taverns, the regulars were having a good time, telling each other interesting stories from past missions, washing it down with pints of light beer. The main character listened to all the funny stories with half an ear while chewing a bun. Now he understood that everything in this world was quite complicated. He couldn't stop at headquarters as a mercenary because of the seed of darkness. The medallion from the forest didn't give him answers, and he didn't yet understand where to look for them. He intended to first explore the local villages, but it was impossible to be on the road all the time. It took him 3 whole days to get to this place. There were many more people in the whole world than he could have expected, and he couldn't count on meeting such nice people like Tanya in the future. It was good that at least he had earned a little money. It should be enough for the first time, although he was not very knowledgeable about this matter. Compared to what Darian gave the main character, he earned much more money. That moment among the bags of coins, he saw a note. He wondered who it was from. It turned out that the note was written by Darian, and it said that if this message fell into the boy's hands, then the mentor had died. This meant that he was able to get out of the root forest. Perhaps right now, the guy is experiencing difficulties in the human world, because his whole previous life is radically different from what he is faced with now. But there is no need to be upset about this. Darian went beyond the edge with a calm soul, but this was not what he wanted to tell the boy now. If he was wandering around the world without any purpose, then he should definitely go to Baden. There is an academy called Greta, where people of the same age as the main character study there. He can learn more about people. Not only the rich study there, but also the poor. No one cares about origin, however. The guy will not be able to enter the academy on his own, so he needs to find a man named Eden Kudrow. When Helmet finds Eden, he will have to show him the sword so that the man understands who is in front of him. He must also remember that in the human world, not everything can be solved by force, but since the guy coped with the training, then he will also cope with life in the human world. The main character noticed that the mentor wrote the text with a shaking hand. This means that at that moment he had practically no strength left, but he still held on and helped him as best he could. Warmth and gratitude filled his soul, because the young man knew where he needed to go. Finally, something became clear thanks to this short letter. At that moment, a waiter came up to him and brought the food the guy had ordered, for which he had to pay 15 marks. Since the guy didn't understand what each coin meant, he gave the waiter 15 instead of 1,000 marks, causing him to be overjoyed. Besides, the main character was planning to spend the night here, so he asked to hang out and it would also be on him. When the waiter left, the young man began to reflect on the fact that not long ago he had received 90,000 marks for his work, but he had not thought that prices in the human world would be so low. He intended to stay overnight here and set off on his journey at dawn. At that moment, a rather drunk and impudent mercenary approached him, whose whole appearance indicated that he had done this with bad intentions. He received moral support from two more equally impudent men. They clearly intended to take Helmet's money. They tried to force the young man to buy them 20,000 marks worth of alcoholic drinks since he was so rich. The waiter was terrified, but Helmet showed absolutely no emotion, not understanding what was wrong with these people, so he refused. The refusal enraged the drunk man, and he almost attacked the main character with his fists. Moreover, he showed his displeasure in such a way that he knocked over the main character's bowl of food onto the floor, but this was already a mistake on his part. But even now, Helmet wanted to resolve their conflict peacefully. But this was not part of the mercenary's plans, so he tried to hit the guy, but he quickly blocked the blow. The man couldn't understand where such a frail-looking guy got so much strength from. His comrades rushed to his aid trying to fight off the boss, but nothing came of it. On the contrary, Helmet dodged the attack and immediately counterattacked. Thus, all the bad people were beaten and shook with hidden rage, pain, and resentment. But the main thing was that the instigator still didn't understand that it wasn't he who was in control of the situation, but the main character, which is why he got hit in the face with a table. Meanwhile, the young man took his things and asked the mercenary to leave and not to irritate him. The man lay on the floor, clutching his broken nose, realizing that he had nothing to offer this guy. Therefore, he decided to leave the tavern with his friends, but he promised that Helmut would regret his actions. They warned the main character at the end that he needed to be extremely careful now, especially at night, because now it was just a matter of time before they caught him and killed him. The door slammed behind them, and Helmet realized that people like Caleb were everywhere in this world, and it was incredibly annoying. However, the young man was absolutely calm, but the waiter was not. He said that the guy needed to leave quickly, because war had been declared on him by Blackhawk. It was an organization of robbers who operated in back alleys and dark alleys, and all members of the organization had a criminal past. They would kill anyone if it brought them money, and if the guy didn't leave this village now, he was in danger of death. The protagonist suddenly realized that these guys would cause him more trouble than he wanted, so the best option would be to fight them right now. But at the same time, he didn't want to create a mess in the place where he planned to spend the night. The waiter said that there was no time to stand and think. He was going to return the guy's money for the night's stay, just so that he would leave his establishment as quickly as possible. Helmet wasn't particularly worried about this, but he was still going to go into the forest behind the young man's tavern, and when those individuals came again, tell them that he was waiting for them in the forest. Meanwhile, a group of bandits gathered in one of the gateways. They were going to go and kill the guy because he showed them such disrespect and even disdain for him. Their leader was seething with righteous anger, furious that some of his men wanted to back down. Suddenly, another bandit came running to them who found out where Helmet was now. It turned out that the guy went into the forest, which is behind the permanent yard obviously, that this was how he tried to escape. But they couldn't prove that it was a trap, so they believed that the guy had signed his own death warrant by choosing such an escape route. Yes, the forest was not their profile, but they were sure that there were traces left there, so there were plenty of opportunities to catch up with the guy and kill him. They were confident that they could kill the main character, considering him a child who had not yet experienced this world. Meanwhile, the young man sat on a branch in the forest and reflected on the fact that during his time with the mercenaries, he learned that many people were like demonic beasts. But there are also people who are ready to protect each other at the cost of their own lives. But being human is more difficult than he thought. And the human world is not a place where everything can be solved by force. But the main character still did not know how to solve problems without using it. But he was 1000% sure of one thing, that people who act like demons should be treated like demons. But after dealing with the Blackhawks, he realized that these people were even more insignificant than he had imagined. They weren't even fit to hold a candle to Tanya. They were so weak and uninteresting in battle. Overall, the girl was the strongest of all the people he had met here so far. And the more he fought with people, the more he would get to know them. Tomorrow, as soon as it began to get light, he planned to set out on his journey. And now he would go to the hotel and rest a little. Only suddenly the seed of darkness inside him made itself known, piercing his body with an incomprehensible pulsation. A sharp pain disoriented the young man and made him stagger, almost fall. This was the first time this had happened to him, so he couldn't understand what was happening to him now and what to do next. He needed to stay away from demonic energy, but that hadn't happened even when he was killing demonic beasts in the root forest. He never experiences such pain, but the person he killed was not a demon, so why does he feel so much pain now? An unexpected guess dawned on the protagonist. The families of darkness most likely fed on the killing of any living creature, be it a demonic beast or a human. If that was the case, the guy was in really big trouble. If word got out about the Hawks' murder, their entire group would start hunting him. Now he understood how careless he had been. If he couldn't kill his opponents, then he would have to learn by any means necessary to avoid any battles, so that the seed of darkness would not grow within him. Besides, he now needed to get to Baden as quickly as possible and get at least some support. Meanwhile, one of the Blackhawk leaders received word that part of their group had been destroyed. If they continue their search, they will definitely be able to find the location of the person who caused such a mess. It was a good idea, because it was impossible to leave everything like that. So it was necessary to find the culprit and punish him. Meanwhile, two second-rank mercenaries entered Mr. Anton's office. These were the infamous Max and Paul, who now planned to make their living through theft and other criminal activities. Anton admitted that in their time it was difficult to find people willing to join their organization, so he was very grateful for the fresh blood. However, they were currently in a bit of a mess and couldn't accept the first person they met without a little checking. But this already made Paul a little wary, so he wanted to know the details of the so-called check. Anton had no doubts about the skills of the second-tier mercenaries, but the Blackhawks were not an ordinary group of mercenaries. They were doing something that the authorities did not particularly approve of. Therefore, I would not want any of the squad members to have any problems due to a sense of justice or stupid morals. Therefore, he needed the guys to prove the sincerity of their intentions. And for this, he had one small matter. Paul realized that despite their abilities, Anton wanted to test whether they were suitable for the Blackhawks or not. After which the leader of the organization handed the newcomers a piece of paper with instructions. This business should be easy for second-rank mercenaries. It turned out that 5 members of the organization had gone missing last night. The rest of the group learned that they had gotten into an argument with a mercenary and hadn't returned, so they went searching and found the bodies of their comrades. After examining the bodies, it became clear that they had been killed with the first blow, but the man still couldn't find any other evidence that would indicate what killed his people. Max was curious how one person could kill 5 ordinary mercenaries. All they knew about the stranger was that he had black hair, black eyes, and looked to be about 16 years old, and his skills should be at least rank 3. Max and Paul were required to find the teenager, kill him, after which Anton would gladly accept them into his ranks. Moreover, the man pays a high price for such services, so newcomers will be satisfied. True, Anton didn't yet know the exact location of the main character. He only knew that Helmut had recently spent the night in a hotel near the forest, so it was logical to assume that he couldn't have gone far. However, the main character came to a beautiful building, but he did not realize that he would have to take a certain risk again. He needed to move as stealthily as possible and not attract much attention to himself. Therefore, he had no other choice but to come to the mercenary guild to carry out his plan. He took out his mercenary certificate and said that he wanted to take on a task. The girl standing at the reception desk was surprised when she realized that he really did belong to the vanguard, because he looked very young. She was very surprised because young third-rank mercenaries were a rarity, but she was ready to give him a job. He really needed a job, but the pay didn't matter. The main thing was that the assignment was in the vicinity of Baden. The girl understood that many people wanted to get there, so the easiest way was to take an order for an escort. So, one lady from a noble family is looking for protection for a trip and is ready to pay 800 marks for it, although there was one interesting condition. The condition, however, was not trivial. The woman had to be accompanied by a mercenary who she was 100% satisfied with. Others might not even try to get the job. The condition was indeed interesting, and to fulfill it, the protagonist decided to go to the store and buy himself some new presentable clothes to impress the customer. When he took on the assignment, the receptionist gave him a couple of pieces of practical advice. The first was that when working with aristocrats, he should look presentable. The second was that his name should always be on everyone's lips. It's a good thing his charming face can meet all these requirements, so the girl introduced him to this task. The only thing he had to do was buy decent clothes. So the guy went to the first store he came across, where the seller showed him the best clothing options that were available in Baden. The man claimed that this suit was as light as a feather, and the main character would not even feel that he was wearing anything and would flutter like a butterfly. But this suit cost 2,000 marks, and the guy would only receive 800 marks for completing this task. The difference between these two figures was quite noticeable. Nevertheless, he still forked out and bought new clothes, and in them he came back to the guild, where he caught the admiring glances of the employees. The girl claimed that Helmut looked even more handsome than during their first meeting. Moreover, she had already managed to send information about the young man to the client, and, as expected, he was accepted without further ado. Moreover, it was not often that one could meet a mercenary who was to the liking of a lady from a noble family. But Helmut, whatever one might say, looked perfect. At that moment, a man who represented the Charingen family entered the guild. The man looked respectable and came to see the man his ward had hired. At the first glance at the main character, the new acquaintance determined that the young man was quite young, tall, with good posture. Helmut certainly looked great, so there was no reason to deny him the job. So the man headed towards the exit and asked the young man to follow him. Everything would have been fine, but the main character was under surveillance, which he did not notice since professionals were working. Meanwhile, the man confessed that his name was Gilton, and he was the butler of the Charingen family. Helmut also had to know that the Marcus had a high position in society, so he had to watch what he did and said. This was clear. But the young man only worked with cargo, and not with people. But this did not particularly matter, since in the first option he had to protect bags of goods, then, in the second option, he had to protect a person. If things suddenly become too difficult, the guy just has to follow the knight's orders. If he does a good job, he will receive bonuses. It was difficult not to understand the man, so the young man briefly replied that he understood everything. The butler clearly liked the way the main character behaved. He answered briefly and clearly in a military manner. This was an excellent quality for an escort, especially an aristocrat's escort. And now they were already in the Marquis's house, which amazed with its magnificence and luxury. Although no, it was not the house of the Marquis's family, it was just a hotel. But what a hotel! For the rich and famous of this world, here the main character was supposed to meet Lady Charingen. The protagonist realized that his employer had a high status in the human world. In the hotel lobby, the butler and Helmut were met by a tall young man who was most likely one of the Marcus's knights. But he was a little puzzled by the protagonist's appearance, especially his age. But for the butler, the young man's age didn't really matter. The most important thing was the recommendations given in the guild, so the knight had to teach the boy everything. Kedrick had no intention of arguing with the butler, so he shook Helmut's hand. Everything was settled with the first acquaintance. Now it was necessary to find Lady Charingen and introduce her to the main character. It's good that the girl was currently having lunch in the cafeteria. Therefore, without thinking twice, they decided to go there too, so as not to complicate their lives. Meanwhile, a curious scene was unfolding in the dining room. Lady Jenna was pestering a young man named Arya and chattering about everything under the sun. The guy didn't know what to do with himself, but nevertheless tried to swallow at least a piece of the delicious steak. The girl was so captivated by the young man that she did not pay any attention to the butler and Helmut who entered the dining room. She wasn't particularly interested in the protagonist, as all her attention was occupied by the young man next to her. But if the butler assured her that Helmut was good, so be it. However, Arya was already tired of listening to the girl's incessant chattering, so he abruptly got up from the table, since they had a long journey ahead of them, and they needed to prepare for it. He didn't care that the girl was worried and wanted him to sit next to her a little longer and eat well, but next to her he couldn't even swallow a bite. But when Arya walked past Helmet, the protagonist noted that he had a strange feeling when he was around this guy. At this moment, the main character realized that his intuition was correct and there could be no mistake, but he would like there to be. Although he didn't know the reason, this young man was not the simplest. Something about him was alarming and screamed about danger. But he was brought out of his thoughts by the voice of Lady Charingan, who was annoyed by Arya's departure and was about to go to her room. To tell the truth, she didn't intend to spend time in her room. She wanted to catch up with Mr. Arya, that's all. But Helmet was curious whether this man would also participate in this mission. Gilton pleased the protagonist by saying that Arya was only a guest of Lady Jenna, but he was quite a famous person at the Greta Academy in Baden. The girl somehow met him by chance, and since she liked his appearance, she brought him here. Besides, she was only 14 years old, and so it was time to go to Baden and take part in the entrance exams to the Greta Academy. But this interesting coincidence pleased the young man, because admission was also part of his plans. There were only 2 hours left before departure, and all preparations needed to be completed, so the butler asked Helmuta to go to the stables for a horse. Once the guy is finished with the horse, he will have to wait for Lady Charingan at the carriage in which she will ride. The man couldn't help the main character, as he had a lot of things to do himself, so he asked him to contact Kedrick with any questions. Helmet, as usual, agreed briefly, and was used to doing everything on his own without supervision. He chose a beautiful white horse for himself in the stable, although it behaved strangely under him. Although strange, to put it mildly, she was running around the stables as if she had been stung in the ass, and was trying to throw the main character off her broad back. This horse was not like the animals of the Vanguard detachment, which Helmet liked very much. It did not obey. It had a spirit. Helmet was pulled out of his far from rosy thoughts by the voice of the young lady, who again tried to persuade Mr. Arya to go with her in the carriage and talk. She didn't pay any attention to Helmet, which was probably a nice bonus, since he wouldn't have really wanted to put up with all this. But the new acquaintance was completely unlucky, which was evident from his seemingly indifferent face. Nevertheless, the guy talked to the girl but ignored the main character. But when he passed by again, Helmet realized from the soft glow of his aura that he was a magician. But for now, it was neither good nor bad, because they did not communicate or quarrel, but silently set out on their journey. After analyzing his feelings, Helmet came to the conclusion that his strange reaction to his new acquaintance was caused by his occupation. True, he didn't yet understand what class of magicians the guy belonged to, and why he used magic on himself. Something like this was new to the main character, so he decided to keep a close eye on his new acquaintance. Meanwhile, in the carriage, Jenna was testing the waters. It turned out that Arya was the head of the Faculty of Magic. The girl was delighted, as she believed that now she should not have problems with admission, because she was ready to do everything to get the desired result. But the young man decided to pretend that he didn't get the hint, saying that the girl just needed to study hard. Jenna was truly impenetrable, playing the role of the sweet, cloyingly sweet girl who was worried about getting into college. But this didn't work either. Arya suggested repeating all the necessary material again after arriving. But his words did not inspire the girl, because she needed a person who would support her. And this was the wrong decision, because at the academy, all students were self-taught, and it was necessary to accustom yourself to this from the entrance exams. Jenna's education seemed too far away because, in order to study at the academy, she first had to enroll, and if she didn't get anything, what would she say to her strict parents? Unfortunately, her tears had no effect on Arya. He continued to sit there with a stony expression on his face. The only thing he could offer the girl was to find her a teacher who would prepare her for the exams. She had to do the rest herself. It was at least something, so the girl was glad of the offer of help because she hoped that Arya would become her teacher. But she was in for a severe disappointment and refusal, since the magician had no intention of wasting his time and energy on her. He himself had to prepare for the new academic semester, which was already taking up a lot of his time. Yes, and he was tired of her increased attention, so he suggested they take a break, because the road promised to be long. The girl whined, and Helmet drew level with the carriage in the hope of hearing something useful. From this place everything could be heard perfectly, but nothing useful, and for some reason Finn came to mind. Meanwhile, the Black Hawks had identified the main character and were about to set out to catch up with him and kill him. The unpleasant thing was that the guy's squad also included knights, and with them there would be a lot of trouble. The boss understood perfectly well that if someone from the noble family died, he would have problems, so it was necessary to deal only with Helmet. Suddenly, Paul started to back down. He didn't understand why it was necessary to go so far to accept him and Max into the team. It was just like that. The Nighthawks never leave their enemies alive. In this way, they recruited people into their ranks with a similar worldview. No one was happy to have anyone else here. Since Paul was not much of a moralist, the boss's words found a response in his black heart. Meanwhile, the main character's squad stopped for the night. Jenna was predictably unhappy with the conditions in which she had to spend the night, but there were no other options. While the girl was settling into her apartment, Helmut was training again. He had definitely become stronger in recent times and could control the force much better. But there was a feeling that there was some kind of limitation. By and large, he did not have time for regular training in this world, which was upsetting. There was still hope that if he got into the academy, he would be able to overcome his limit and learn to control the force even better. But this was secondary. The main thing was to get rid of the seed of darkness inside, because it was starting to interfere. Suddenly, the young man's attention was drawn to a bird that was watching him. It was a white owl. But it wasn't an ordinary one, it was magical. And with its help, Arya watched the main character, but realized that he had been noticed and decided to roll up his fishing rods. But even these few minutes of observation were enough for the guy to understand that Helmut was not as simple as he seemed. An interesting case. Arya had met many talented mercenaries in his life, but this one was something else. He had reached the 3rd rank at such a young age and was also a force user. But the guy didn't have time to finish his thought because Jenna started banging on his door, and she didn't care that it was late, and her actions were beyond the bounds of decency. But the girl was saved from shame by the maids, who dragged her by the white arms to her room. It was obvious that the girl was trying in every possible way to attract the attention of Arya, who was no longer happy that he had gone with her to Baden. A new day had dawned. The detachment had been on the road for quite a long time, so they decided to make a short stop near a spring. The water in the spring was crystal clear and captivating with its blue color. It is no wonder that many travelers stopped here. It was impossible to resist washing and drinking water. The spring gave the travelers not only refreshment, but also new strength. It was an ideal place to relax, so the border guards quickly prepared food and served it to their young mistress. But the soldiers were extremely unhappy because the girl was served a salad with fresh meat, while they had to settle for dried meat. The only one who ate silently was Helmut. He didn't really understand the complaints of those around him. On the other hand, the guy had already missed Finn's delicious cooking, because the captain spoiled his people with all sorts of delicacies. Taking one sip of water, he suddenly realized that it had a strange taste. At some point, the thought occurred to him that it tasted awfully like poison. But the rest of the squad didn't notice anything, so it must have been his imagination. The knight suddenly felt like taking a nap. Not only were they overcome with sleep, the butler was also falling off his feet, but his pride did not allow him to sit down. But Lady Jenna was sleeping in the carriage, although at first glance she seemed completely dead. He quickly realized that the girl was fine, but as soon as he looked at the other servants, he immediately felt worse. They fell to the ground as if they were falling asleep on the move. Gilton didn't understand what was happening. He looked for support from the knights, but Kedrick was also already lying on the ground, struggling to stay awake. The situation was extremely strange. The butler didn't know what to do, and there was no help to be found. The only one who was not affected by the sleeping potion was Helmut, who did nothing for now and waited to see what would happen next. His sixth sense didn't fail him this time either. It was the water, so he poured out the contents of his cup. At that moment, the attackers appeared in the clearing, namely Paul, Max, and another guy unfamiliar to Helmut. The men thought they had thought out their plan perfectly, but there was a mistake, and the main character did not sleep like everyone else. At this moment, Paul and Max were stunned, not understanding what the mercenary from the Vanguard was doing here. Paul couldn't believe that Helmut was the one who killed the Blackhawk members. It seemed very implausible. Not only did Paul recognize the main character, the boy also clearly remembered Tarek's mercenaries, who abandoned their comrades to die and fled the battlefield. But he wasn't particularly surprised that these traitors had gotten involved with the dregs of society. Oh, how the men didn't like the guy's words. They were ready to shake the soul out of him. Paul was too much like Caleb, insulting and threatening his opponent, considering him inferior. But the protagonist really had problems. As there were too many Blackhawks, they surrounded Helmut, and he had to make a decision on what to do next. But even realizing the disadvantage of his position, the main character was ready to fight back against bad people. But help came from a place the guy didn't expect, just as the Blackhawks didn't expect it. While Arya politely asked the mercenaries to hide their swords and leave here in good health, he was ready to change his mind at any moment. Paul didn't understand his warning. He was only concerned about the money he had spent on sleeping pills. But even though Arya wasn't sleeping, it didn't change anything. There were still a lot more bad people, and they weren't going to leave. The magician didn't intend to do all the work himself, so he asked Helmet to focus on the enemy and not stare at him. There was unrest among the Nighthawks, as the presence of a mage was not part of the original plan. However, Paul was confident that he and Max could defeat the guys, after which the Hawks would have to clean up the crime scene. He didn't want to talk anymore, but he wanted to kill the main character, so he attacked him. But Helmet somehow managed to block the first attack, even with the use of the Force. But Max naively believed that he could defeat Arya, so he asked him for forgiveness in advance for this. But the mercenary's arrogant statements didn't make an impression on the magician, because he knew perfectly well that nothing would come of it. Moreover, death, at least his own, was not part of his plans. Meanwhile, Paul continued to attack the main character. He noticed that the guy no longer said anything, which meant he was no longer as brave and strong. Helmet, however, did not show much activity because he was not allowed to do so because of the Seed of Darkness. Nevertheless, he understood perfectly well that he was lucky to have a magician on his side, because without him, he would have had a very hard time. Paul, however, understood the guy's reactions and behavior in his own way, believing that it would be easy for him to kill him. Therefore, the man put maximum strength into the next attack, and believed that there was no one else who could respond to him. Only this time he was wrong, because when the dust began to settle, it became obvious that the main character was alive and well. Moreover, this was only the beginning, and the guy was waiting, and now he could no longer hold back and was ready to show off his skills. Moreover, the man made a mistake when he followed Helmet and ended up falling into his trap. But Paul just couldn't get it. He thought that it was he who had driven the guy into a corner. But he had no idea that Helmet also possessed the Force, and controlled it much better, which made him head and shoulders above his opponent. Self-confidence and pride. That's what blinded the man. He didn't understand that by losing control, he would lose before even starting the fight. He again attacked the protagonist who stood there, calm as a boa constrictor. And then he dodged, easily and effortlessly, as if dancing, without using the Force to do so. And a second later he found himself behind the enemy and was already attacking him using the Force. It was difficult to withstand such an overwhelming onslaught, because so much power of mastery was invested in it. Paul was weak. He couldn't help but block or dodge the blow, so the protagonist slammed him into the ground. The enemy was defeated but not yet dead, breathing heavily and coughing up blood, but alive. He lay there, shaking with anger and fear, and the question of where the guy got so much strength was racing through his head. Helmet had no intention of answering, and this time he was ready to let the man go if he took the rest of the mercenaries and did not pursue him. This hurt the man's pride. He was ready to die rather than run from the battlefield. But Helmet found these words funny. After all, the young man remembered very well how not long ago Paul had run away, leaving his comrades to die. Helmet had nothing more to say to the man, and he walked away, while Paul became hysterical. Meanwhile, near the camp, Arya had exhausted all the mercenaries. Most were already unconscious, and Max could barely stand on his feet. The guy's strength amazed the imagination and frightened the mercenary. He had seen different magicians, but this one was different. One of the magician's abilities was to use his powers to lift stones into the air, which he then sent at his opponents. The men were powerless against this ability and therefore could not dodge the stones that served as a kind of cannonballs. By and large, Arya didn't care what these people were up to, but he wasn't going to let them get away with such impudence. After all, they ruined his mood and became his path. So they deserved everything that happened to them and will continue to happen. Seeing that the mercenaries were losing to the young man, Max decided to use all his strength to defeat him. But all his attempts looked very funny and ridiculous to the young man. He didn't even move from his place while counterattacking. But there Max could do nothing against the huge magical fireball. He couldn't run away. He couldn't dodge. He couldn't block. It was rapidly consuming the man. Only 3 mercenaries remained on their feet, and the magician offered them to follow him to Baden, but even there their fate was sealed. But the mercenaries again did not understand the good intentions of the young man. They tried to escape, but it was useless, because the guy possessed a special kind of magic that could instantly stop them. Indeed, after a few seconds, magical shackles wrapped around the mercenaries' bodies, preventing them from moving. Some of them tried to dodge, but the guy was skilled even in throwing a lasso, a magic lasso. Obviously, they were unable to escape, so they fell motionless to the ground. However, he was starting to get tired of this situation, as he had to spend a lot of time and energy on fast-running cowardly men. Although some of them managed to escape, the main thing was that he managed to catch the supposed leader of this group. But when he turned his gaze to the place where Max should have been, He was not there. In the noise, he tried to hide in the fog. Indeed, although Max was seriously wounded, seeing that the magician had turned his attention to other mercenaries, the man, by hook or by crook, hid in the forest. He didn't understand what had just happened, why the Blackhawks were hunting one of the Vanguard mercenaries, and how he had gotten himself into such a mess. Moreover, none of the spies warned him that there was such a powerful magician in this small detachment. But his adventures didn't end there, as Helmet passed by, and it was lucky that the guy hadn't noticed him yet. The surprising thing was that there wasn't a single scratch on the guy. This suggested that Paul had lost and was possibly dead. At that moment, he became careless, so the protagonist turned around and looked at the stone behind which his enemy was hiding. However, he didn't focus on this and moved on, and Max realized that this guy was so strong that it was better not to mess with him. Despair overwhelmed the man. He had no idea how to live on or what to do, since by and large, he had lost everything. At this moment, the protagonist came to the cart and saw that the rest of the mercenaries were tied up. But Arya was alive and well. The magician was glad that his new acquaintance was alive and wanted him to continue tying up their captives, albeit with rope this time. Only Helmet didn't understand why this should be done, since they were all already connected, albeit magically. It was all simple. The young man didn't want to waste his magic holding the bonds, because the road to Baden was still long, and he wanted to hand all these people over to prison. Suddenly, Helmet remembered that he had heard this word before from his mentor. This is a place where people who did wrong were sent. But the problem was that Paul and Max ran away again. It was a shame, of course, but nothing could be done. But Arya was curious why the sleeping pill didn't work on the main character like it did on all the other servants. The only thing Helmet could find to answer was that he didn't drink the poisoned water. And in fact, he didn't even lie. One sip doesn't count. But the magician didn't believe it, so he threw one of his magical bolts at the main character, but he dodged it. Helmet didn't argue, but he also had a question about why Arya was still on his feet and how he had bypassed the effects of the sleeping pill. After all, the guy saw his new acquaintance drinking spring water. The magician's answer was also quite laconic. He could cleanse his body of the toxins that entered it. Jell assumed that this was because the guy's body was covered with a layer of magic-like armor. Now this was interesting, because no one could see this peculiar shield. But the main character somehow could. But he didn't see this shield, he felt it with his skin. Arya did not raise the question of why his new acquaintance had been pretending all this time that he saw, heard, and knew nothing. It was all simple. The main character wasn't interested in the topic, and if his comrade wanted to hide something, let him hide it. It didn't concern him. This was quite strange, so the magician got angry and walked away towards the carriage. Towards evening, all the servants came to their senses. They were quite rested, but at the same time they understood that many irreparable things could have happened while they were awake. The butler understood that his mistress would always be indebted to Helmet and Arya, so it was important for him to know how he could thank them. But neither the magician nor the mercenary needed any rewards. They did what they had to do, nothing more. Although, by and large, the butler paid more attention to the magician than to Helmet, so the guy turned the blame on him. The main character didn't like this clever move, but his expression didn't change and he replied that yes, he hadn't fallen asleep, and yes, he had taken part in the battle, and yes, the medicine had practically no effect on him. This answer satisfied Gilton, because he had already heard that there were people who were not affected by drugs because they were not susceptible to them, but such people were extremely rare and he had never met them before. Then the following happened. Out of nowhere, Jenna appeared in the clearing and began to grab the magician by the hands, hug him, and look at him with loving eyes. Obviously, she was in love with the young man and considered him her destiny, because he did not abandon her in trouble, but, as a brave knight of her heart, saved her from danger. She was so excited and wanted to pay for the good mag, but her pressure frightened and embarrassed the guy. But Arya decided to end everything without listening to the girl to the end, saying that he had a fiancé in his homeland, and after graduating from the academy, he was going to formalize their relationship. At that moment, all the hopes, dreams, and desires of the young girl collapsed, turning into dust under her feet. But the knight and the butler understood that this was a disaster, either because they had known Jenna for a long time, or because they couldn't even dream of a calm journey now. The girl's world collapsed. She became hysterical, which no one could stop in any way, but she had to move on. Nevertheless, they put the crying girl into the carriage and set off. The butler and the others did not sleep for almost a day, but they covered the rest of the way with almost no problems. And now the gates of the beautiful city of Baden opened before them. The main character was in such a big city for the first time, and it both delighted and frightened him. Now it was time to say goodbye. The butler was glad that fate had brought him together with Helmut, so he promised to recommend him for other tasks in the guild, as he was pleased with the work done. He also paid him 10,000 marks, which was significantly more than the previously agreed amount, so to speak, with additional bonuses. The protagonist gratefully accepted the payment and noticed out of the corner of his eye that Arya had already entered the gate. He had no intention of giving in to his new acquaintance, so he quickened his pace and overtook him, doing this in complete silence. Nevertheless, he was grateful to the magician for his help during their mission, because he understood that without him, he would have had a hard time. Arya did not respond to the protagonist's words of gratitude, as he was too embarrassed to answer anything. This was all well and good, but Helmut needed to find a way to get into the academy. But when the protagonist decided to take a stroll through the city streets, they were much wider, and there were many more people than in the places he had visited before. If you didn't know where to go, you could easily get lost in these labyrinths of streets and never be found. A few minutes later, he finally reached the academy and even went inside, amazed by its size and architecture. He remembered perfectly well that he needed to find a man named Eden Kudrow, but the guy had no idea where to look for him. Suddenly, he noticed the secretary's girlfriend and decided to approach her and ask the question that was bothering him. Perhaps she could tell him something. She was so immersed in her work that she did not immediately notice his approach, so she was very scared when he banged on the table. Not particularly concerned about the rules of decency, the protagonist without hesitation asked where he could find Mr. Kudrow. The plus was that the girl's reaction told the main character that this man worked here, so he could count on a meeting. But in order to arrange a meeting, the girl had to write down the young man's personal information. He gave his name without any problem, although in his heart he knew that it would mean nothing to the man, since they did not know each other personally. However, nothing hurts to try, and he obediently followed the secretary to the appointed place at the appointed time. The girl drew a pentagram on the door with a slight movement of her hand and asked the young man to come inside. It was surprising, although quite expected, that here on every corner there was, is and will be, magic. The guy was interested in what kind of outstanding student he was, one of Darian's, and how he would perceive Helmut's appearance in his life. It was good that he was at least willing to meet with him, and the rest could be agreed upon. At least that's what the guy was really counting on. But for now, taking a deep breath, the main character crossed the threshold of Sir Kudrow's office. But he didn't know any Helmut, and was puzzled by the young man's impudence. But he wanted to know who had the courage to so brazenly deceive the secretary and ask for an audience. And the guy had better tell the truth. The protagonist looked at his interlocutor and understood that this man was not as strong as Darian, but among the swordsmen he met in the human world, he occupied a worthy place thanks to his strength. If this man were a mercenary, he would definitely have been awarded first rank, and maybe even higher. The silence dragged on for too long, and Mr. Kudrow repeated his question. He needed to know why the young man was looking for him. It was too difficult to explain everything in words, so Helmut took out Darian's sword and showed it to the man. The man couldn't believe his eyes, and the boy said that he had been told that the man would understand everything after seeing the sword. Once the initial shock had passed, Mr. Kudrow began to examine the sword carefully. At first glance, it was an ordinary sword, but upon closer inspection, its balance and strength indicated that it belonged to his mentor. Having realized everything fully, the man did not know what to do or what to do, but he hoped that Darian was still alive. But unfortunately, the man left this world not long ago and went to his ancestors. Having thus given Mr. Kudrow hope that his mentor was alive, Helmut immediately shattered it into pieces. The man almost cried, because Darian had disappeared about 20 years ago, and Mr. Kudrow swore on the family's behalf that he would repay him for saving him at the time. But if the old man's sword was in the hands of a young man, it meant that he was his last disciple. It seemed like everything was clear. Now it was interesting why the young man was looking for him. It was all simple. Helmut wanted to study at this academy, and the man had to help him get in. Now everything was clear. Obviously, Darian had sent the young man here specifically and told him in detail about this place. Moreover, the old man thought that Mr. Kudrow would become a kind of protector for the main character in this place. This may have been partly true, but the man needed to know at least some information about the main character. So first he asked how old the guy was. The only problem was that the young man didn't know exactly how old he was. He could only give an approximate age. He thought that he was either 14 or 15, which greatly surprised the man, because how could a person not know how old he was? It seemed absurd and impossible. Seeing that things wouldn't go any further, Mr. Kudrow decided to start by checking the young man's skills and his power level. By and large, this was a standard pre-entry test. After all, it's unlikely that a 14-year-old boy would be accepted into elementary school. This would mean that he would study on par with his peers, but there could be problems if his skill level was insufficient. But if he is 15 years old, then he can take the exams as an exchange student. And this would be an excellent option for the current situation. Although at that moment the man wondered whether Darian's student should take swordsmanship exams, since it was obvious that this level would be more than high. So he thought that if he could explain that the boy was a student of such a great man, he could be accepted into the academy without entrance exams, and that would be enough to confirm his abilities. At that moment, the protagonist realized that Darian had helped him not only in the root forest, but also here. And then he froze, clearly understanding that the mentor had taught him in the root forest and not in the human world. The only problem was that people in this very world did not know what happened to Darian. They thought that he simply disappeared in an unknown direction and did not go into exile. This suggested that even the mentor's acquaintances did not know where he had been all this time, but the boy was sure that the mentor had ended up in the root forest, not of his own free will, but under duress. This means that the person who sent Darian to the root forest was not an ordinary person, since he was able to hide the truth from everyone in the state. And if the person who sent the mentor to the forest finds out that his student is in the human world, then he will no longer have time to study, and they will take away his opportunity to get rid of the seed of darkness and send him back to the root forest. So he turned down the opportunity to skip the entrance exam and the offer to voice his studies with Darian. He couldn't explain to Mr. Goodrow the reasons for his actions, but if anyone found out that he was Darian's student, his life would be in danger. And these were not empty words, but the pure truth. Mr. Goodrow believed that no one had the right to attack the disciple of such a great man, not realizing that the human world itself had abandoned Darian. But the protagonist was in no hurry to reveal all his cards and asked the man to be patient because someday the day would come when he would be able to tell everything. But it was clearly not today. After thinking for a bit, the man came to the conclusion that the reasons for the guy's silence could indeed have been serious, so he no longer rushed him with answers. Nevertheless, the guy could turn to him for any advice or help, since Darian had trusted him at one time. That's what they decided on, but they needed to start preparing for the exam. The man was going to collect and complete all the necessary documents, and the boy was going to improve his skills. After some time, the man brought Helmet to the swordsman's training hall. Only everything was a little different. Mr. Goodrow himself trained here, and did not allow just anyone into this room. Besides, he was sure that Darian wouldn't have taken the boy as his apprentice if he was talentless. But he had to see for himself, so the training fight was mandatory. To begin with, the main character had to chop up a huge log, but he had to do this with a wooden sword and not the one he came with. The boy had to chop down a birch tree, which was considered the strongest of all trees, and if he could chop the log, then for his age it would be a great achievement. The young man understood the task set before him, and the sword directed part of its force into the wooden sword, which confirmed part of Mr. Goodrow's guesses. He assumed that the boy could control the force. And then the main character, without thinking twice, took and chopped a birch log into two parts. The man did not expect such a turn of events, so he looked more than shocked. It was clear that the young man was capable and possessed a high level of skill and strength, but he still had room to grow. Now Mr. Goodrow had no doubt that with such skills the boy would pass the exam at the academy without any problems. The protagonist was pleased with the thought that he could now attend the academy with peace of mind, as his mentor had wanted. Yes, swordsmanship skills would be enough, but the man suggested that the main character also take a written exam, as he wanted to make sure that the guy knew at least something else besides swordsmanship. At that moment, a monkey started beating a drum in Helmet's head because he was having problems with writing. The problem was not only in the letter itself, but also in the fact that the guy had very little knowledge. He received extremely low scores on all the tests, which were below 10. There are only a couple of weeks left before the exam, but at this rate the guy won't get into the academy, no matter how much he wants to. With such a grade, the main character will not be able to enter the university. Even with a private tutor, he will not have enough time to improve his knowledge. However, Helmet still had great hope that the man would be able to teach him. But this was impossible. Since Eden worked at this academy, he should not have personal relationships with the students. And if he teaches the protagonist, then there will be problems for both of them. It's true that there was one unspoken rule at the academy. Students were busy preparing applicants, but since there was little time left before the exams, the best of the best were already taken. This created problems, since there was no point in sending Helmet to the worst students. At that moment, an interesting idea came to the young man's head. He remembered the magician with whom he had traveled to Baden and asked the professor if a guy named Aria was studying there. It would be strange if the professor had not heard of this outstanding student who had become the best and received the highest score on the magic exam last year, but he did not understand why Helmet was asking about him. Now this was interesting because if Arya was the best student, then this meant that he was the best magician in this academy among the students. In any case, the main character didn't know anyone except this guy, and he had no other ideas on how to improve his knowledge. Therefore, he decided to ask his new acquaintance to work with him, since he had no other choice anyway. It didn't immediately dawn on the professor what the main character had said, but when he realized everything, he was surprised again, as he didn't understand how Helmet could know their best student. So, the main character found Arya and asked him to study with him, but the guy didn't look happy, rather the opposite. He was annoyed by such an offer. But more than anything in the world, the magician did not like to deceive stupid people, especially empty-headed swordsmen. Besides, he thought that the main character came to the city solely to carry out tasks, but he never expected that Helmet would decide to enter the academy. The mage didn't understand why the mercenary needed something like that. But if he wanted to become a student so badly, he should have taken care of it himself, and he wasn't interested in tutoring. The only thing was that the main character had listened to most of Arya's tirade and started playing his own game. He needed to get into the academy, and the magician was the best student. However, this did not dissuade the guy, and he insisted that he would not train Helmet under any circumstances. So he sent the young man away again because he had no intention of changing his plans no matter what the guy told him. But Helmet wasn't asking for a favor. He was going to pay Arev for his tutoring services because any work should be paid for. On the one hand, the offer interested the magician, but on the other hand, it offended him. Besides, he wasn't sure that the mercenaries would have enough money to pay him for his services, and how much Helmet could pay him, a few pennies, nothing more. Only the main character was determined and was ready to pay as much as Arya told him to. Arya demanded 100,000 marks, not a penny less, and the entire amount at once, not in parts. Helmet agreed to these conditions without hesitation, but he was not going to disclose how and where he would look for the money. Moreover, he was ready to bring the entire named sum tomorrow, after which he would immediately begin training. It looked extremely implausible, so the magician didn't believe him one bit. But for Helmet, this was not a big problem because he received 90,000 marks for his first task and 10,000 for the second, thus reaching the required amount. He was ready to give all this money to his new acquaintance. The main thing was to start training right tomorrow, because there was very little time left before the exam. Arya didn't know what to do under such pressure because he had named an exorbitant sum in order to avoid working with the main character. And now he would have to do it, even if he really didn't want to. Still, in his heart, he was hoping that the main character would not have the necessary amount of money, but he was nevertheless ready to wait for him here tomorrow morning. At this point, the conversation ended, and Arya flew into the room like lightning, paying no attention to his fellow students. And Helmet was pleased with himself, since he had managed to arrange tutoring on his own, which meant he could afford to rest today. Only one of the magicians looked after him thoughtfully, not understanding what to expect from the stranger in the future, since his best student was reacting to him like that. The next morning, as if nothing had happened, Helmet came again to the appointed place at the appointed time, where Arya was already waiting for him. By and large, the magician hoped until the very end that the mercenary would not come, but since he did come, then let him give the money. Arya was even more surprised when the main character handed him a bag of money, which contained exactly 100,000 marks. If that was the case, the magician understood that he had to keep his word. But up until that moment, he had never taught anyone. And if the guy failed the exams, it would be his fault alone, and no one would return the money anyway. But the money issue didn't bother the main character at all. It was important for him to enter the academy, and everything else didn't matter. At that moment, Arya realized that he should have simply refused, and that he had asked for such a sum of money purely out of pride and a sense of self-importance. So the boys came to the library and began to conduct their first lesson in complete silence. Helmet was diligently writing something, and Arya was watching him carefully, wondering whether this guy had a chance or not. Only now did the wizard realize that his new acquaintance was too problematic, although he had not noticed this before. But to be honest, this mercenary learned faster and better than most of the students in the magic faculty. But something about Helmet Arya was bothering him, so he decided to find out if the main character really lived alone in the forest. This question didn't exactly surprise the protagonist, since he thought that the magician had noticed this fact during their trip. Overall, Arya was a good person, but you had to be careful with him because he put two and two together too quickly, so you didn't want to answer a question directly. Meanwhile, the magician continued and said that Helmet has a good memory, he grasps everything on the fly, and he can also concentrate on one task better than anyone else. This was good, but everything else was bad, because Helmet knew neither the basics of science nor etiquette, and the results of the verification test were from the category of hug and cry. The magician did not know how to shove everything necessary into the head of the main character. There was only one way out. Finish preparing for the core subjects and devote the rest of the time to etiquette and improving communication skills. Besides, one way or another, Helmet paid 100,000 marks for tutoring the best student at the academy, and he will break his back, but teach the guy everything he needs. Although money no longer played such an important role, it was a matter of honor, and the magician did not want to tarnish his honor. Therefore, no matter what dementors pursue the main character, he will definitely enter the academy. In the evening, it was time to solve ethical problems. Helmet had to correctly answer the question, what should he do if a classmate stole money from him? The first thing that came to the protagonist's mind was to cut off the thief's hand. But he did not voice this answer, since he needed to come up with an ethical response. Since cutting off his hand was not an option, Helmet suggested stealing his thing from the thief quietly, that's all it took. But even with this answer, he got into trouble, and Arya didn't know how else to explain to Helmet that this couldn't be done. Helmet didn't understand what was wrong with his proposal because he couldn't fight, but stealing his own thing was an option. Arya tried to explain that neither a fight nor a repeat theft would change the situation. They needed to talk and resolve the problem peacefully, to make their classmate understand that he had acted wrongly and that this was not the way to go. In this way, he will be able to forgive the person but not the act he committed. This is the kind of justice that is taught at the academy. The science of human relationships was much more complex than the protagonist thought. He didn't expect that being human was so difficult. He constantly needed to learn morality and common sense, but he was used to solving all issues by force. To become even a little like the ideal Darien, he will have to study a lot, communicate, and solve complex problems without using his fists. 2 weeks was not enough for this. He needed more time, more hours in the day, more effort. 2 weeks passed in the frantic pace of training. Arya was waiting for his protege near the library, causing a stir among the girls. Everyone was interested in who their idol was studying with all day long in the library and what kind of relationship they had. Meanwhile, Helmet, not noticing anyone around, approached his tutor. The exam had just ended, and Arya didn't understand why it was being held in the library this year. Naive Helmet didn't realize that it was a rhetorical question, and no one was expecting an answer from him. But he still said that the library was quiet, which is why the exam was held there. Arya didn't want to admit that he was worried and waiting for Helmet, so he made up an excuse about books. But then he still asked how the main character was doing. The protagonist remained meaningfully silent, but Arya assumed that there were no problems, so their agreement was fulfilled. The magician wanted to end their relationship at this point, but nevertheless wished his new acquaintance good luck on the practical exam. And again, Helmet thanked the magician for his help, confusing him and causing him to turn around. The guy couldn't admit that Helmet's words had touched him again, so he hid behind a mask again, saying he took the money and worked for it. However, it was only thanks to Arya that he was able to pass the theoretical part of the exam. Now it was time to take the practical part, but his opponents were also no pushovers. But he didn't hesitate and went to the fencing room, where many people had already gathered. Once inside the room, he decided to stand to the side and wait his turn, as the instructor would call everyone one by one and lead them into the testing room. As time went on, he thought that he didn't know what to do after the exam. He could have gone to practice since he spent all his time studying and forgot that his body also needed to be strengthened. Suddenly, Sabat Rukol, who was the second son of the Rukol family, came up to him to introduce himself. The main character was in no hurry to give his name. He didn't understand why the guy wanted to get to know him. He clearly wanted something, but the question was what? Helmet was silent for a long time, not because of the academy rules, but because he did not understand why the guy was talking to him. Sabat, so to speak, wanted to become the main character's friend, but he didn't look friendly. If so, the main character gave his first name but did not give his last name, since he knew nothing about his real family. Rukol thought it would be a great idea to find out information about the main character's family in advance, since he would have to do it later anyway. But Helmet didn't know what to answer to something like that, because he wasn't the one who was going to tell him about Elga and Darien. He also couldn't use his mother's supposed surname, since he was abandoned in the root forest, along with the family medallion. Therefore, it became the best option for him to refuse the tempting offer of imaginary friendship, where he would have to rush into talking about his family. You should have seen Sabat's face at that moment when he realized that in front of him was not an aristocrat, but a real commoner. Realizing his mistake, the guy began to laugh evilly, since he considered it beneath his dignity to do business with commoners. But at the same time, the guy did not understand why Helmet was so confident in himself. It's no surprise that after a couple of minutes, the blonde guy and his friend started making fun of the main character, ridiculing him and considering him a local idiot. Yes, and Sabat couldn't believe that Helmet had money for a tutor. At that moment, one of the professors appeared behind the blonde man and clearly hinted to him that it would be better to go prepare for the practical exam rather than discuss the standard of living of other students. Sabat must remember that this educational institution has strict rules, and anyone can study if they have the ability and talent. On top of that, the practical exam was supposed to start in 5 minutes, so everyone had to be ready for it. The blonde walked past the protagonist and then reminded him that commoners should know their place and not show off when aristocrats are around. At any other time, Helmet would have simply punched the guy, but now he let him go because he had learned to be a man and solve problems without using his fists. After some time, all the students took their seats in the classroom, and the professor began giving instructions. The practical exam will be held in 2 stages and students will be divided into groups. The main character hardly listened to the professor. He felt dozens of angry, envious glances from the applicants. He realized once again that the human world in this academy were no different from the root forest. Humans are the same as the demonic beasts in the root forest. There are both leaders and victims among them. But here physical strength is of little importance because what is more important is lineage, family, surname, position in society. This was made clear to him today. But this did not shake Helmet's desire to enter the academy. So he will pass the practical exam, no matter what the cost. So, it was the protagonist's turn to pass the first stage of the exam. He had to cut a log with a wooden sword. The use of the force was allowed. They were given 5 minutes to complete this task. If the guy completed it within the allotted time, he moved on. If not, he went home with his things. The main character had done something similar before, but this time he felt there was some kind of catch. However, he didn't drag it out. He directed the force into the sword and cut the log into 2 even parts. The examiner had never seen anything like this before, because even teachers couldn't split a log into 2 parts with one blow, but the boy did it. At this point, the first part of the exam was over for the guy, and he could calmly wait for the second one to begin. In the room where other students had gathered, Sabat began to tease the protagonist as soon as he stepped over the threshold of the room. So far, Helmet has managed to keep himself under control. The question is how long he can do this. Following Helmet, the examiner entered the room and said that the second part of the exam was sparring. Each sparring session will last 8 minutes in the presence of a professor who will determine who advances and who does not. Sabat, as usual, began to say nasty things again, believing that since he is an aristocrat, he is a priori stronger than others, and Helmut is weak since he is a commoner. It was obvious that the blonde man was deliberately provoking the main character and wanted him to hit him. The main character understood that the blonde man was really annoying him, so much so that he wanted to hit him. To stop him from talking nonsense, he wanted to knock out every single one of his teeth. So to restrain himself, the guy clenched his fists until they hurt. But everything was decided by chance, when the examiner named the main character and the aristocrat Andro, pairing them up for a sparring match. Sabat was confident that he would have no trouble dealing with one worthless commoner. Even 8 minutes would be a lot for this. This was the opportunity the protagonist had been looking for a legitimized fight. In the room where the instructor led the boys, professors were already sitting at a table, who were supposed to evaluate the skills of future students. The protagonist didn't quite expect to see Eden Kudrow among the professors, but at the same time, it was a bit reassuring, even though the guy was confident in his abilities. Moreover, the man had already told his colleagues about Helmet, so he asked them to watch him closely and not miss a single move. Besides, this was the first time that Mr. Kudrow had singled someone out, which meant that the guy in front of them really must be a diamond in the rough. The professor did not comment on this, because in a few seconds they would see and understand everything themselves. The sparring will be divided into 2 4-minute parts. The one who drops the sword or cannot stand on his feet loses, and the point is not to win the competition, but to demonstrate skills. Everyone understood everything, and the sparring could begin, and the guys took their starting positions.